Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where curiosity softens at the edges and the ancient world settles itself beside you like an old friend returning at the quietest hour. Tonight we're drifting into a story older than temples, older than kingdoms, older even than the first lines humans ever pressed into clay. It's a story carried by moonlight and marsh winds, by lullabies whispered across the first rivers of civilization. And at its centre is a figure whose presence seems to move gently through the ages, never demanding attention, never raising her voice, yet shaping the destiny of gods and cities through nothing more than quiet constancy. Her name is Ningal, the mother goddess of Sumer, the lady of reeds, the one who gave birth to deities whose names would echo through millennia. She's not one of the loud gods, not a figure of storms or war or thunder. She is a quieter kind of cosmic force, one that nurtured, one that listened, one that held the beginnings of things with a tenderness that ancient people felt deeply enough to carve into the permanence of stone. Before we begin wandering into the moon-swept land she once ruled, I'd love to know something simple and grounding. Where are you listening from tonight? What kind of evening or morning or drifting between things moment are you settling into right now? Sometimes it feels almost magical, the way these stories find you wherever you are, wrapped in your own time and your own world, while the past opens its door just a little wider to let you in. And if this quiet kind of exploration feels like a gentle companion to your rest, I'd be truly grateful if you tapped the like button or subscribed. It helps this little sanctuary of soft-spoken history reach others who might be in need of a peaceful drift into sleep or a gentle path through ancient worlds. Now, take a breath. Let your shoulders drop in a way they probably needed. Let the day loosen itself. Tonight, we follow the glow of a goddess who once walked the mist-filled marshes of the ancient south, where moonlight shivered across the reeds and the earlier cities rose from the mud of the great rivers. We begin where the ancients told their children that all things once began, in a world not yet crowded with the voices of mighty gods, but held by a softer presence, a mother before she even had children, a light before anyone named it. There's something quieting about imagining such a landscape, before the noise, before the bustle, before the grand temples and the long lists of kings, there was simplicity. Water moving gently through reed thickets, the low hum of insects, the distant cry of cranes gliding over marsh waters, the air thick with warmth, the ground soft beneath bare feet, and moonlight settling across everything like a thin blanket of silver. This is where Ningal belonged, not in battlefields or councils of feuding deities, but here, in the hush of twilight, in the slow rhythm of river life. The people who lived in these wetlands, long before empires carved their ambitions into the world, looked at the moon and felt a presence in its light. Something maternal, something steady. Not a light that commanded, but a light that comforted. And over time, that feeling gathered shape and became a name, Ningal, the Great Lady. She was believed to be born from the waters themselves, from the sweet marsh reeds, from the quiet parts of nature that most gods rarely noticed. Her mother, the goddess Ningikuga, embodied the reeds and the riverbanks, the sheltering places where life began. It made sense, then, that Ningal inherited this quiet strength, this nurturing presence. She wasn't a goddess of sudden upheaval. She was a goddess of continuity, of gentle beginnings, of the slow unfolding of life. And in a world where storms and fire and destruction played such powerful roles in mythology, her presence feels like a deep exhale that civilizations desperately needed. People often imagine goddesses of creation as powerful figures crafting worlds with a single gesture. But Ningal's kind of creation was different. Hers was the creation that comes through patience, devotion, and steady presence. She gave birth to Nanna, the moon god who would become one of the central deities of Mesopotamia. Through Nanna came Inanna, the radiant goddess of love and war, and Utu, the god of the sun, justice, and truth. 3 celestial bodies moving across the sky, all said to have started with Ningal's embrace. If you think about it, the ancient people imagined the heavens themselves emerging from her quiet body, a kind of cosmic motherhood that wrapped the sky in something protective and constant. But Ningal's story wasn't only about divine children. She was also the caretaker of cities, especially When the moon god became the patron of that city, Ningal became its mother protector, the one who watched over it as a parent watching over a sleeping child. People prayed to her for comfort, for fertility, for protection. They whispered her name at night when the moon rose over the rooftops, believing her presence moved through the streets with the pale light. And the temples built in her honour were not just places of worship, but sanctuaries where priests and priestesses believed they were directly tending to the goddess's needs. Imagine the glow of lamplight flickering on carved reliefs of reeds and lunar crescents, the scent of incense rising in slow, curling strands, the sound of soft chanting drifting through the temple halls. This was Ningal's atmosphere, calm, warm, welcoming. Even the myths that describe her carry a softness. In one ancient poem, she and the moon god share a love story that feels almost human. There is tenderness, there is affection, there is longing. The divine couple meets beside the reeds, speaks to one another with gentle words, and builds a household filled with luminous children. It's a rare glimpse into a mythology where gods are not only mighty but also quietly loving, where the domestic world is as sacred as the cosmic one. Ningal represents the anchor in the swirling stories of the divine. Without her, the heavens would lack their steady rhythms, and yet her story is also tinged with sorrow. When the great city of fell during a terrible invasion, one of the most heartbreaking laments in world history was written in her voice. The lament for dating back almost 4,000 years, describes Ningal begging the higher gods to spare her city. She cries out, not with fury but with grief, not with rage but with heartbreak. The poem paints her as a mother watching her children lose their home, powerless to stop what unfolds. Even as the gods refuse her pleas, she stays with the city, grieving in its ruined streets, calling to her people with a voice full of sorrow. Her devotion didn't end with prosperity. It continued through ruin. That kind of loyalty must have meant something profound to the people who worshipped her. There's a quiet strength in a goddess like that. Not the strength of storms or fire or conquest, but the kind that sits beside someone through their darkest moments. The kind that holds the world together through gentleness instead of force. And perhaps that's why Ningal, though not the most famous of the Anunnaki, left such a deep emotional imprint on ancient poetry and prayer. She was a mother not just to gods, but to humanity, to cities, to the moonlit nights when people sought comfort in her glow. As we drift deeper into her story tonight, we'll explore how she shaped myths, nurtured civilizations, and lingered in the memories of people long after her temples fell to dust. Because some figures, even in ancient stories, don't need thunder to be unforgettable. Some shape the world quietly, softly, almost imperceptibly, like moonlight spreading across still water. And so we step from the opening into the next movement of her story, letting the echo of her name settle gently around us as we move toward the place where silence first gave birth to a goddess. There is a kind of quiet that belongs only to the earliest moments of the world, a quiet so complete that later ages could barely imagine it. Not the silence of an empty room or a still night, but a far older kind of stillness, the kind that comes before breath or movement or memory. When the ancient Sumerians tried to describe the very beginning of things, they spoke not of thunder or fire or sudden bursts of creation, but of a world suspended in this heavy, waiting stillness. A place where nothing rushed and nothing argued and nothing yet carried a name. They pictured a vast expanse of darkness and gentle water, a place where sky and earth had not yet separated, where everything that would someday exist rested in a state of patient possibility. And in that slow, unhurried quiet, the first glimmer of divinity began to take shape. It's difficult to imagine that kind of beginning from the noise and movement of our own lives. Even the calmest moments today carry the faint hum of modernity, the barely noticeable stir of things constantly happening. But long before cities rose or stories were etched into clay, the world felt different. It was raw and undivided. There were no storms yet, no celebrations, no temples, no boundaries, and no elaborate hierarchies of gods. Only a stillness that stretched in every direction, so absolute that one could almost feel it holding everything together. If time moved then, it moved slowly enough that the earliest gods seemed to emerge not in sudden bursts, but in long, gradual shapes rising from the quiet like shadows forming at dusk. The ancient people didn't describe this moment with grand declarations or precise explanations. They simply understood the beginning as a kind of waiting, as if the universe itself was taking a long inhale before speaking. And somewhere inside that vast breath, the first divine figures stirred. They began as impressions before they became personalities, as forces before they became names. There was no hierarchy yet, no clear realms for each deity. They simply floated in possibility, untethered to the kinds of stories that would later define them. Among these early beings were the ancestors of Ningal, still unformed, still blending with the soft contours of the world that had not yet woken. The earliest myths describe the primordial waters, the Abzu, as the cradle of all things. These waters weren't the churning tides or crashing waves of later stories, but calm and endless. A slow-moving sea beneath an equally slow-moving sky, almost indistinguishable from one another in their stillness. This was the first environment of the gods, the place where divinity swam before ever carving order from the quiet. And it was here that the first whispers of life began to gather shape, not dramatic or sudden, but like the gradual thickening of mist in early morning. Even then, before Ningal had any form or intention, the essence of quiet nurturing was already present. The Sumerians believed that the earliest divine energies flowed gently, not with demands or violence, but with the steady patience of water creeping through reeds. This was the atmosphere that birthed her lineage. Before she existed, the qualities she would embody were already present. Softness, steadiness, the ability to hold life without forcing it. The world didn't erupt into existence, it unfolded. And in that slow unfurling, her story began long before she had a name. As time moved through this unshaped world, the first separations began. The sky started to lift itself from the waters, and the faint outline of land pressed upward like a breath rising under a blanket. Gods took their first positions. Anunnaki drifted apart into sky and earth, giving structure to the formless expanse. The great forces that would shape the cosmos acquired identities that aligned with their nature. And into this gradually organising world, the lineage of Ningal found its place. Her mother, Ningikuga, emerged from the marshes and their quiet sanctuaries, carrying within her the essence of reeds and the first sheltered spaces. Before temples existed, the marshes were the sacred sites of the world, and Ningikuga represented the first whisper of divine gentleness that took root there. In imagining Ningal's earliest presence, it helps to picture these marshlands before humanity ever set foot along their edges. The waters were calm, and the reeds grew tall and thick, forming natural walls of shelter and protection. Light moved differently then. Without structures or smoke or dust, moonlight fell softly on every surface, spreading evenly across the still water. The nights were long and unbroken, and the stars reflected perfectly on the rippling marshes, so that the sky and earth appeared to merge into one. It would have felt like living inside a boundaryless world where the heavens dipped low enough to touch. This is where Ningal's essence belonged, before she took on any defined role. Not yet a mother, not yet a wife, not yet a figure central to worship, but a presence living in the margins between light and water. The ancient people didn't say she came into being with sound or force. They imagined her materializing slowly, the way the moon appears through thin clouds. First a suggestion, then a shape, then a presence. Her earliest form was that of a quiet lady of the reeds, the kind of divinity who didn't command attention but was simply there, steady and calm, woven into the fabric of the natural world. Before she ever gave birth to gods, she existed in a world that didn't yet know what creation meant. She was part of the first movement toward life, part of the shift from silent waters to structured lands. And even though the myths don't describe her earliest moments in detail, the qualities she embodied later allow us to imagine the world that shaped her. A world without noise, without urgency, without conflict. A world that moved slowly enough for gods of gentleness to form fully, with patience rather than force. As civilizations formed and storytelling grew more elaborate, this early silence faded from memory, replaced by scenes of divine councils and dramatic conflict. But the foundation remained. Beneath every temple dedicated to Ningal, beneath every myth that mentioned her children, beneath every prayer spoken in her name, the faint outline of that early world still lingered. A world where silence was the first teacher and the first companion. A world that taught gentleness before power, calm before order, quiet before creation. It's striking that even in the oldest hymns, Ningal is never described as a goddess who rose with a conquest or a proclamation. She was simply there, a figure shaped by the earliest stillness. The people of Sumer must have felt something reassuring in this idea. In their daily lives, surrounded by the unpredictable rhythms of rivers and seasons, a goddess born from calm was something to hold on to. She represented a source of stability, a reminder that not all beginnings needed to be loud to matter. Some of the most important foundations of the world came from the quietest origins. As humanity began settling along the rivers, building the earliest villages and observing the movements of the sky, they carried with them fragments of these primordial stories. And they looked to the moon, rising and falling with steady rhythm, and saw in its light the qualities of a goddess born long before cities learned to shine on their own. They shaped Ningal's identity around this lunar presence, imagining her as part of the same calm that had once held the sky in silence. Even long after the marshes filled with settlements and became bustling landscapes of trade and worship, people imagined her walking through them as a figure still connected to the first stillness of the world. This idea of a divine presence rooted in quiet beginnings resonated deeply with the Sumerian worldview. Their mythology often balanced powerful, forceful gods with figures who represented continuity and nurturing. Ningal belonged to this gentler lineage, the line of deities who didn't push the world into motion but preserved its softer edges. She wasn't shaped by cosmic war or dramatic transformation. She emerged from the natural rhythm of a world taking its time to become itself. In many ways, the silence that surrounded her earliest presence continued to define her roles, even after she became a mother to major deities. Her connection to moonlight, to calm waters, to the soothing rhythm of night all tied her to the earliest sense of the world. When people prayed to her, they didn't ask for storms to be subdued or enemies to be defeated. They asked for comfort, for fertility, for the quiet continuity of life. They turned to her not in moments of crisis, but in moments when they needed reassurance that the world still had room for gentleness. This quiet origin also influenced how she was depicted in stories. Unlike more forceful gods, her actions rarely carried a sense of loud consequence. Instead, she guided, protected, and soothed. She represented the earliest cradle of existence, the soft structure that held the world before anything else took shape. And that sense of being part of the world's earliest shelter is what allows her story to move so seamlessly from the deep past into the mythic eras that followed. As myths evolved, they carried with them the memory of this beginning. Even as humanity built complex societies and faced the chaos of history, they imagined Ningal as tied to a world that existed before conflict or loss, before ambition or destruction. Her presence was a reminder of a time when the world was small and still and waiting. And perhaps the people of ancient Mesopotamia found a particular comfort in this idea, because they lived in a landscape shaped by both abundance and unpredictability. Rivers could give life or take it. Seasons could nourish or starve. Cities could rise or fall. But the moon and its ancient mother remained steady, tied to a time even older than the first field ever planted. The notion of a divine presence shaped by early silence also explains why her myths are filled with moments of reflection. In the lamentations written in her voice thousands of years later, her sorrow comes through not in rage or vengeance, but in a deep, quiet grief that feels as old as her origins. Her reactions are shaped by the same stillness that formed her, a kind of sorrow that moves slowly through the ruins of cities without shaking them further. This kind of emotion feels ancient, tied to the earliest rhythm of the world, where even grief had a softness to it. And so, before she ever held the cradle of her divine children, Ningal belonged to a world without cradles, without temples, without boundaries. A world where silence was the first environment and gentleness the first force. Understanding this early landscape gives her later roles deeper meaning. She wasn't merely a mother by title. She was a mother shaped by a world that valued quiet beginnings, a mother whose entire identity grew from the slow, patient unfolding of the earliest days of creation. Moving forward from this early stillness into the next phase of her existence means stepping into a world beginning to gain shape and texture, a world where the first distinctions were forming and where her own identity started to gather form more clearly. The earlier stories that spoke her name never described a dramatic moment of emergence. They didn't portray a burst of brilliance or a sudden gesture of creation. Instead, they told of a gentle revealing, as though Ningal had always been present in the world and was simply waiting for the right light to fall upon her. The dawn of her presence was imagined as something that rose slowly, not unlike the moon lifting itself above the horizon, one pale sliver at a time. There was no announcement, no trembling earth, no startled heavens. There was only a subtle shift, a soft glow filling the edges of the world where reeds swayed and waters moved with steady patience. The ancient people imagined her forming not from a violent source, but from the meeting of two calm forces. Light and water were her earliest companions, and the merging of these elements gave her essence its shape. Light, because she was bound to the moon even before she mothered the great lunar deity. Water, because she came from a lineage of marsh goddesses who carried the sheltered spaces of the world within them. The combination of these two elements created not just a figure, but a presence that felt natural, as though she belonged to both the night sky and the wetlands in equal measure. When they described the moment she first took form, they spoke of light, falling across water in a way that seemed alive. The shimmer on the marshes would stretch into something more defined, something that felt intentional. People watching the earliest evenings must have felt a kind of companionship in that faint illumination, long before they identified it with a goddess. It wasn't just moonlight. It was a presence that moved with purpose. In the earliest hymns, the words they used to describe her birth echoed this blending of elements. She wasn't carved or called or summoned. She was shaped naturally, like a figure rising from the interplay of tide and glow. Before she gained the title of mother or consort, Ningal was imagined as a young goddess shaped by the world's gentlest forces. She carried in her the softness of dawnlight and the calm steadiness of tides. The mythology implies that she learned from these elements before she ever found her place among the other gods. Light taught her constancy, the slow cycle of brightness returning even in the longest nights. Water taught her nurturing, the steady support life found in the marshes. These were the quiet lessons of her forming, the ones that made her who she was long before the world gave her roles. In the early days of creation, when the divine world had not yet fully arranged itself, Ningal moved through the landscape like a figure still deciding where she belonged. She wandered among the marshes, observing the rhythm of things, how light softened the reeds, how water cradled the beginning of life. She drifted through the first soft evenings, taking in the way the world breathed, slow and unhurried. These movements carved out her identity, giving her a sense of belonging not through force or decree, but through simple presence. Her dawn was not a single moment, but a gradual gathering of selfhood. Myths often portray the youngest gods as impulsive, curious or restless. But Ningal's early existence carried a different tone. She seemed to understand the patience of nature. She mirrored the calmness of the tidal rhythms. She embodied the steadiness of the moon's slow rise. Her dawn was not a transition from nothingness to being, but a soft shift from potential to presence. She learned the world not by challenging it, but by listening to it. That quality, the ability to listen, would define her for all the ages that followed. Even the earliest descriptions of her appearance reflect this gentle beginning. She was said to carry the pale radiance of the moon in her presence, a glow that didn't overwhelm but comforted. Her garments were imagined as flowing like river reeds, soft and moving with the slightest breeze. Her eyes were described as steady and reflective, not fierce or blazing. She was a goddess shaped by observation rather than confrontation. Every story, even those written centuries later, kept that tone when describing her. She was luminous without being harsh, serene without being distant, gentle without being fragile. As the world gained structure and more complex relationships formed among the divine, Ningal found her place naturally. She didn't conquer it or claim it. She drifted into it the way water fills its basin. Her connection to the moon deepened until the two became inseparable in the minds of those who looked up at the night sky. People believed that she carried the moonlight with her wherever she went, and that the lunar glow was an extension of her presence. The pairing made sense to them. The moon was steady, reliable, soft in its illumination. It guided travellers at night, marked time for farmers, and brought calm to those who watched it. It was everything Ningal embodied. The idea that she shaped the moon's nature rather than the moon shaping hers was deeply rooted in Sumerian belief. They saw the moon as something that reflected the essence of its divine mother. Its phases were her breathing. Its glow was her presence. Its cycles were her rhythms. This relationship was not one of hierarchy, but of harmony. The moon did not represent her power. It represented her personality. Her dawn wasn't just the beginning of her existence, but the beginning of a celestial bond that would endure for thousands of years in human memory. Before she became part of the grand divine household, she lived beside the wetlands in myth, where the tides met the quiet land in steady movements. These marshes didn't just shape her identity, they shaped the myths themselves. When ancient people wrote hymns about her, they often described the environment more than they described the goddess. The reeds, the water, the moonlight, the gentle sounds of life settling as dusk fell. They built her character from these elements so deeply that she became inseparable from them. Her dawn was woven into the natural world. As the celestial order became more structured, the moon god Nanna rose into prominence, and Ningal became his natural counterpart. Their meeting, described in several tales, reflects the same soft tone that her dawn carried. It wasn't a sudden or forceful union. It unfolded gently, like the way moonlight spreads across still waters. Their connection felt inevitable, not because of destiny or command, but because the world they represented found comfort in bringing light and tide together. The earlier storytellers didn't speak of passion or rivalry or drama in their union. They spoke of harmony, of two presences finding each other in an already quiet world. Once Ningal became the mother of Nanna's children, her identity expanded. But this expansion never replaced her original nature. She remained the calm in the divine family, the steady presence that linked the celestial lights to the earthly waters. Her dawn prepared her for this role. a goddess shaped by light and tides, was naturally suited to raise deities of radiance and cosmic rhythm. The moon, the sun, the starry sky. All of these were connected to her through the soft qualities she developed in her earliest moments. Her role as a mother did not erase her role as a figure shaped by nature. Instead, it reinforced the early sense that her gentleness had power. Not the overwhelming, commanding kind of power, but the kind that holds things together without drawing attention. Ancient people saw in her the first example of a creator who didn't make through force but through presence. Her dawn introduced this form of creation to mythology, showing that nurturing could be as foundational as shaping or commanding. As her myths spread through early cities, especially through Ur, her connection to moonlight deepened even further. People imagined her walking through their streets at night, her presence felt in the soft glow that touched rooftops and courtyards. Children were told that the moon's glow was Ningal watching over them. Farmers believed her light protected their fields in the quiet hours. Priests believed her presence lingered in the incense smoke rising through temple courts. And as these beliefs took root, her dawn in the marshlands became the spiritual homeland of an entire civilization. Through every stage of her story, the essence born in her earliest dawn remained. Even when she took on the role of protector of Ur, even as she spoke laments when the city suffered, she retained the qualities shaped by light and tides. In times of grief, she mourned with a quiet depth. In times of prosperity, she radiated calm assurance. She never shifted into a goddess of dominance or fury. She stayed true to the steady nature of her first existence. To understand her story fully, one must keep returning to that early dawn, when she was shaped by the natural elements. That moment isn't just an origin. It's a key to everything she later became. The way she spoke, the way she loved, the way she grieved, the way she walked through the world. All of it came from that early blending of steady light and moving water. Her identity was anchored to the gentle parts of the world, and every stage of her story reflected that. Her dawn teaches something about how ancient people viewed the beginnings of life. They didn't imagine the world emerging from sudden conflict or overwhelming force. They imagined it forming through gradual shifts, through gentleness, through the steady presence of nurturing forces. Ningal, shaped from light and tides, embodied this belief perfectly. She represented a beginning that didn't need spectacle to be meaningful, a beginning that took its time, that observed, that listened, that grew naturally as the world gained structure. Even now, thousands of years later, the stories about her carry that same softness. The memory of her dawn remains in every tale that mentions her, as though the ancient people wanted to ensure she was never separated from the gentle forces that shaped her. And as her presence moves from this early dawn into the next movement of her life, she carries with her the steady glow of those first moments, bringing the calm of light and tides into everything that followed. As the world settled into its early rhythms and the divine families found their first patterns, the quiet presence of Ningal began to be noticed by more than the reeds, more than the still waters, more than the soft light that played across the marshlands. Her existence had taken on a shape gentle enough to move without disturbing the world around her, yet steady enough that the heavens themselves seemed to adjust their glow when she passed beneath them. In this slowly forming cosmos, another presence drifted toward her with a brightness that carried both curiosity and serenity. This was Nanna before he became the central lunar deity, before temples and kings aligned themselves with his cycles, before festivals lit the night in his honour. At this early moment, he was simply a young god of evening light, a being who found himself drawn to the calm radiance that Ningal held so naturally. Their earliest meeting, as told by ancient storytellers, didn't unfold with grandeur or sudden revelation. It was described instead with a simplicity that echoed her origins. They crossed paths not on mountain tops or in celestial halls, but near the soft edges of the marshlands where Ningal first learned the rhythm of the world. Nanna's glow reflected gently on the water as he approached, and the soft illumination made the reeds sway, as if greeting an old friend. The myths say he saw her among the quiet ripples and felt a sense of recognition that came not from fate, but from harmony. He moved closer until the light he carried met the glow that surrounded her, and the two blended together as though they had always been meant to share the same sky. In the ancient imagination, their connection wasn't described with dramatic intensity or overpowering emotion. It was built from understanding, from shared calm, from the feeling that the world had created two beings whose natures complemented each other without strain. Nanna, with his rising radiance, brought the cycle of night into the heavens. Ningal, with her steady presence, brought gentleness to the cosmic order. Together they formed a bond that felt natural, grounded, almost familiar even to those who heard the stories for the first time. The moon's glow and the marsh's soft light became one presence, and this union shaped one of the most enduring relationships in the ancient Mesopotamian pantheon. The earliest hymns portray their union with details that feel almost domestic, something rare in a mythology often filled with storms and wars. Nanna approached her with a calm similar to her own. He didn't command her nor overwhelm her. Instead, he sat with her by the quiet waters and spoke with a tenderness that mirrored the slow rise of the moon. They shared conversations that later scribes described in gentle, steady verses, not filled with urgency, but with a kind of intimacy rooted in patience. These early encounters established the tone of their entire relationship, one in which connection grew from steady presence rather than sudden force. As the stories go, Ningal welcomed him without hesitation, for she recognized in his light a reflection of her own nature. Their union became a symbol of balance, a merging of two gentle cosmic rhythms. In later texts, this union was not only emotional, but cosmic in its importance. Through their embrace came the celestial order that shaped the night, the regular movement of the moon across the sky, the marking of months and tides. The moon's rise and fall became not merely cycles of nature, but expressions of their connection, a visible rhythm that humans could observe and trust. The people of Sumer would later align their calendars, their festivals and their rituals with Nanna's journey, all of which were believed to be born from the steady harmony between him and Ningal. Their union also deepened Ningal's identity, expanding her influence while preserving everything that made her unique. She didn't become defined by Nanna. Instead, she shaped him as much as he shaped her. Through her, his glow gained warmth. Through him, her presence stretched farther into the heavens. Their bond became a blend of earth and sky, marsh and moon, water and light. No myth portrayed them as competing forces. They were partners, each strengthening the other in a way that felt foundational to the early cosmic order. In telling how Nanna came into existence, ancient stories described his birth with a sense of calm continuity. He came from her embrace, formed not through conflict or storm, but through steady radiance. The myths often said that he inherited her softness and her patience, traits that defined the moon's slow and predictable movement across the sky. They believed his glow came from her, that she carried the lunar light in her being long before he took his place in the heavens. The moon's phases were seen as reflections of the nurturing cycles she embodied, each shift a quiet reminder of the mother who shaped him. When Nanna was born, the world gained its first true measure of night. Before him, darkness was simply something that happened when the sky dimmed. After his emergence, night gained structure. It had a rhythm, a movement, a glow that guided and comforted. This change wasn't sudden or forceful. It came as a natural extension of Ningal's presence. The stories say she held him in her arms beneath the marsh reeds, and the moonlight spread outward slowly, filling the world with a soft illumination it had never known. Her embrace gave shape to his identity, and the world adjusted to this new rhythm without resistance. The people who later worshipped Nanna believed that his calm nature came from her influence. They imagined her as the reason the moon never rushed, never stumbled, never faltered. His steady path across the sky mirrored the steady way in which she walked among the marshes before she gained her celestial roles. Even in the grand temples built in his honour, her name was always spoken beside his, because the two were intertwined from the very beginning. Without her, the moon's glow would have lacked its warm steadiness. Without him, her presence would have remained closer to the earth. Together they connected the heavens to the wetlands, the divine to the natural. Their household, described in sacred texts, became one of the most stable divine families in Sumerian mythology. They lived not in a palace of thunder, or a realm built by conquest, but in a lunar sanctuary that reflected their gentle origins. This home was imagined with soft illumination and quiet halls, a place where divine children would grow not in turmoil but in calm. The imagery used in the hymns evokes a sense of safety, of warmth, of continuity. Through this household, Ningal's nurturing nature shaped not only Nanna but also the gods who came after him. The birth of their children, particularly Utu and Inanna, added layers of meaning to this union. Each child carried a form of radiance, a continuation of the light that first came into the world when Nanna was born from Ningal's embrace. Utu became the sun, a strong, unwavering presence whose light defined the day. Inanna became the morning and evening star, figure bursting with vibrancy and complexity. Through these divine children, the celestial order gained its structure, and all of it traced back to the quiet union between Ningal and the moon god. This motherhood did not diminish Ningal's identity, it expanded it. Her gentle presence spread from the wetlands to the heavens, from the calm marshes to the endless night sky. The birth of Nanna deepened her connection to light, and the birth of her other children strengthened her role as a goddess whose influence spanned time, nature, and the celestial world. These developments didn't replace her earlier roles. They built upon them, creating a progression that felt natural and unforced, just as her dawn had been. The myths describing her relationship with Nanna often lingered on the way they spoke to each other. Their exchanges were filled with quiet affection. They spoke in tones that carried no threat, no rivalry, no hidden motive. They shared thoughts about the cycles of life, the rhythms of the world, and the ways in which their roles would shape the cosmos. These quiet dialogues reflected not just divine romance, but cosmic cooperation, the merging of two gentle forces into a steady foundation for the night sky. As Nanna gained prominence among the gods, Ningal did not retreat into the background. She stood beside him in all ceremonies, all rituals, all divine gatherings. The ancient people believed that when Nanna travelled across the sky, Ningal walked with him even if her presence wasn't always visible. They imagined her steadying his path, ensuring that his light remained constant for farmers watching their fields and travellers navigating the long night roads. In the city of Ur, which later became the heart of Nanna's worship, her presence was honoured with equal devotion. People prayed to her at dusk, believing she brought calm into the transition between day and night. They offered her milk, bread, and gentle music. They recited hymns written in soft tones that carried no urgency. For them, Ningal was not simply the mother of the moon god. She was the source of the peace that night brought, the comfort behind the glow, the presence that made the lunar rhythm trustworthy. The story of Nanna's birth from her embrace is not only a divine origin tale but also a reflection of the Sumerian belief in quiet power. Creation did not always need to be explosive. Some of the most important forces in the world came from tenderness, from stillness, from slow, steady emergence. Ningal's role in shaping the moon's glow showed that gentleness could define the cosmos just as strongly as force. Her identity became a reminder that the world wasn't built only by storm gods and warriors. It was also built by beings who held the world softly. From her embrace came a light that would guide countless generations through the night, and as her presence continued to intertwine with Nanna's, the sky gained a sense of continuity that reflected the earliest qualities she embodied. Moving from this part of her story into the next, her influence only deepens, expanding into the celestial lineages and earthly memories that held her name long after temples crumbled and empires passed into dust. As time moved through the earliest ages of the world, the connection between Ningal and Nanna shifted from quiet companionship to something that resonated deeply through the heavens. Their union, built on gentle presence rather than cosmic force, began to shape not just the marshes and the night sky, but the entire framework of celestial order. These early divine families were still forming, still finding their roles, still settling into their identities. And as the world became more structured, Ningal's presence no longer moved only through reeds and moonlit waters. It began to radiate upward and outward, becoming part of the luminous architecture of the sky. Her identity shifted subtly, not by abandoning the gentle origins that shaped her, but by expanding them. She became the source from which new forms of radiance emerged, not through sudden gestures, but through the same patient nurturing that defined her earliest existence. The ancient stories always describe this moment not as a dramatic elevation, but as a natural continuation of who she already was. A goddess shaped by calm light and steady tides, becoming the mother of celestial beings felt like the next step in a story that was unfolding without haste. When the myths turned to the birth of her divine children, they wrote with a steady tone, as though the world itself paused to observe how these new radiances came into form. Their arrival wasn't depicted as an event that shifted the balance of existence. Instead, it was imagined as a quiet expansion of the glow that already surrounded her and Nanna, a widening of the light that had comforted the world since the beginning. From Ningal came the deities who would illuminate day and dawn, who would walk across the sky just as gently as she walked through the marshes in the earliest myths. The first to arrive was Utu, who would become the god of the sun. In many mythologies, solar deities burst into existence with overwhelming power, marking their arrival with fire or brilliance that blinds. But in the Sumerian memory, Utu's emergence was described in a way that aligned with his mother's nature. The sun did not erupt into the sky. It rose. It grew from the same nurturing presence that had shaped the moon's steady glow. Utu's light was imagined as an extension of Ningal's gentleness, carrying with it a sense of calm strength rather than harsh intensity. Later depictions of Utu often portrayed him as a god of justice and fairness, qualities that connected back to the steady patience he inherited from her. His birth marked the first true division of night and day that carried intention rather than coincidence. The world gained a rhythm not just through Nanna's nightly glow, but through Utu's daytime guidance. This new structure brought a sense of order to the early landscape, and in every cycle of sunrise the ancients saw Ningal's influence reflected in her son's steady ascent. He didn't blaze into the world or clash with other gods for dominance. He arrived with reliability, with warmth that nurtured crops, with light that supported the growth of early civilizations. His presence was not destructive, it was sustaining, and that quality led many to describe him as a god whose strength came from stability rather than from force, an inheritance clearly rooted in his mother. Soon after Utu's rise came the birth of Inanna, whose arrival carried a different kind of radiance. While Utu embodied steadiness, Inanna embodied intensity. Her luminosity did not mirror the moon's softness or the sun's calm strength. She became the morning star and evening star, the bright point of the sky that held both warmth and fierceness. Inanna stood out even among the divine, filled with energy that moved between tenderness and boldness, between creation and challenge. Her arrival added complexity to the celestial world and brought a kind of brilliance that shimmered with movement rather than stillness. Despite her vibrant nature, the stories always traced her origins back to Ningal's nurturing. Inanna might have grown into a deity of passion, war, love and discovery, but her earliest existence came from the same steady embrace that shaped her siblings. Ancient texts sometimes described her birth with a mixture of awe and familiarity, as though the people recognized that this powerful goddess carried within her the gentle beginnings of the mother who first held her. Even the strongest radiance could come from calm origins, and Inanna embodied that contrast fully. With Utu and Inanna born, the world gained a complete cycle of light. The night held Nanna's glow, the day held Utu's radiance, and the dawn and dusk carried Inanna's brilliance. These three lights gave rhythm to life, shaping the earliest calendars, guiding travellers, marking harvest seasons, and giving structure to the rituals that connected humans to the divine realm. All three lights came from Ningal and her steady presence. Her story became intertwined with theirs, and her identity shifted from the Lady of Reeds and Marshes into the mother whose children shaped the passing of time itself. Even though Utu and Inanna became central figures in later myths, the ancient people never separated them from their mother. They believed she remained part of their strength, guiding their movements with her calm influence. In temples dedicated to Utu, priests often invoked Ningal's name beside his, acknowledging that his justice carried the same measured patience she embodied. In shrines built for Inanna, worshippers spoke of her as a goddess who inherited her mother's nurturing softness, even as she pursued challenges with unparalleled intensity. The people saw Ningal's presence in each of them, woven into their divine personalities like a quiet thread of origin. The stories lingered on the moments after their birth, describing how Ningal held them close and observed their early glow. She was not a distant mother, nor a goddess overwhelmed by her new role. She nurtured her children with a calmness that reflected her earliest existence. Each of them grew within her care, learning the rhythms of the world through her steady presence. Utu learned the path of daylight, steady and predictable. Inanna learned the cycles of stars, shifting and brilliant. Both grew in ways that reflected parts of her identity, transformed into their own distinct lights, but anchored in her essence. The myths described her household as a place where luminescence gathered calmly. They imagined halls lit not by torches or fires, but by the natural glow of her children, a soft illumination that made every corner feel warm and alive. This imagery wasn't meant to imply grandeur, it was meant to convey life. The house where Ningal raised the gods of light was a sanctuary of warmth, not a palace of dominance. It was a place where radiance developed naturally, shaped by a mother whose influence encouraged steady growth rather than forceful expansion. Even as her children grew into powerful cosmic figures, Ningal's role didn't diminish. She became the quiet guide behind their journeys, the presence who kept their paths gentle even when their responsibilities grew complex. In Utu's later stories, his commitment to fairness came not just from his personal nature, but from the example set by the goddess who raised him. In Inanna's tales, her capacity for deep affection carried shades of her mother's nurturing even when her ambitions led her into dangerous realms. Both children held within them echoes of Ningal's earliest qualities. Her role as mother extended beyond her immediate children in the eyes of the ancient people. They saw her as a parental figure for the entire celestial cycle. They believed that her nurturing steadiness was what kept the balance between day and night, between rising and setting, between the radiant movements of the sky that guided their lives. Ningal wasn't just the mother of specific gods. She became the mother of light itself, the origin of the cycles that made time understandable. The role she played in shaping cosmic order made her an essential figure in temples across Mesopotamia. Worshippers didn't see her as distant or unreachable. They saw her as a gentle divine presence who understood the world intimately. Her motherhood made her relatable, not in a human way, but in a cosmic one. She represented the idea that the world itself had been nurtured into being, not forced or commanded, but guided with patience. The calmness she carried into her role as a mother became a comfort to those who lived in a world filled with uncertainties. People prayed to her when they needed steadiness in their lives, when they wanted reassurance that the cycles of light would continue uninterrupted, when they sought quiet protection. Her influence wasn't the kind that brought sudden miracles or dramatic changes. It was the kind that provided support in simple, consistent ways. Farmers looked to her for the steady return of daylight. Sailors looked to her for the quiet glow of the moon on the water. Families looked to her for comfort during long nights. She became a goddess whose power was measured not in force, but in reliability. Her story also revealed something important about the Sumerian understanding of divinity. They believed that the world wasn't sustained just by the mightiest gods, but by those who nurtured, supported, and brought balance. Ningal represented this belief completely. Her motherhood wasn't about authority. It was about being a source of life, light, and continuity. She didn't command the cosmos. She held it gently. The radiance that came from her children became the guiding structure for early civilizations. By giving birth to the gods of the sun and the morning star, she provided people with a sense of orientation, both literal and symbolic. Her presence moved through every cycle of light, shaping how people understood time, work, rest, celebration, and worship. The world gained clarity through the divine light she brought into being, and in every one of those lights, her steady influence was felt. Her identity deepened with each movement of her children across the sky. As Utu rose, people saw the strength she had nurtured. As Inanna appeared in the early evenings, they saw the vibrance she had shaped. As Nanna journeyed through the night, they felt the comfort she'd given him. Ningal's influence was not confined to a single moment or event. It existed in the constant presence of celestial light, in the glowing cycles that gave structure to daily life. As time moved forward in the mythic ages, Ningal remained at the centre of these luminous stories. Her identity as the mother of gods did not replace her earlier nature, but expanded it, making her a link between the calm origins of the world and the structured celestial order that followed. She held both roles without conflict, carrying the stillness of the marshlands into the heavens and holding the radiant cycles of the sky with the same gentle steadiness that shaped her earliest days. From this point in her story, her presence continued to evolve, moving through new roles, new environments, and new memories that further deepened her influence across the ancient world. Long before temples rose in the great cities, and long before hymns were carved into clay tablets to survive the turning of ages, the earliest sanctuary associated with Ningal was not a structure built by human hands, but a landscape shaped by the slow, steady movements of water and wind. It was a quiet marshland where the reeds grew tall enough to form natural walls, and where the subtle sound of water flowing around their roots created a rhythm that felt older than any spoken language. This place, woven from river currents and moonlight, became known in ancient imagination as the House of Reeds, a sanctuary not just for Ningal, but for the first breath of divinity that would one day shape civilizations. The House of Reeds was not a specific building or a single site marked by boundaries. It was a vast, living environment stretching along the southern wetlands of early Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates mingled with land in slow, winding patterns. The early people imagined that before the world was divided into cities and regions, before borders existed, this quiet place served as the cradle where Ningal took her earliest steps. It wasn't a temple with walls and altars. It was a sanctuary of natural shelter, one that held the world in a soft embrace. When the stories spoke of Ningal's connection to this place, they described her not as a goddess who appeared fully formed, but as a presence who grew with the land. Her identity was shaped by the reeds that surrounded her, by the water that mirrored her glow, and by the soft soil that held the earliest movements of life. This environment was not merely a backdrop to her myth, it was a participant. The reeds provided shade, the water offered reflection, and the marshlands gave a sense of calm that felt inseparable from her nature. The ancient people believed that the divine did not always descend from the heavens. Sometimes divinity rose from the earth, from the still places where life gathered itself before taking shape. Ningal's connection to the House of Reeds reflected this idea. She wasn't imagined as a distant figure looking down from the sky. She was a goddess who emerged from a space where the boundary between nature and the divine was thin. The House of Reeds was where she learned the rhythms that would guide her throughout the ages, where she listened to the quiet shifts in the water and the gentle rustling of the reeds, absorbing from them the patience and steadiness that defined her. As time moved through the earliest mythic landscapes, the House of Reeds became a setting of great significance. Mythologists and priests described it as the place where Ningal first understood how to nurture, not through force, but through presence. They imagined her sitting among the reeds as the light of the moon fell around her, holding close the calm that the marshland offered. In these soft surroundings, the nature of her divinity took form. She was not the kind of goddess who shaped mountains or commanded storms. She was the goddess who shaped quiet strength, who guided the gentle unfolding of life. The reeds themselves played an important role in Sumerian symbolism. They were among the first materials used to build shelters, boats, baskets, and tools. They represented the earliest forms of protection and stability for human communities. By tying Ningal's origins to reeds, the ancient storytellers linked her directly to the foundational elements of human survival. She became associated with the beginnings of shelter, with the nurturing that came from creating safe spaces. The House of Reeds symbolised not only a divine sanctuary but the earliest memory of home. People living near these wetlands believed that the movement of the reeds reflected the presence of divine forces. When the wind passed through them, creating a soft sighing sound, they imagined it as Ningal walking among them. When moonlight turned the tops of the reeds silver, they believed she was near, carrying the gentle glow that defined her. Even before cities were built, the House of Reeds served as a kind of temple open to the night sky, one that required no walls because nature itself created the sense of enclosure. The House of Reeds also reflected the maternal qualities that would later define Ningal. In the marshlands, reeds grew thick together, forming clusters that created natural barriers against wind and current. They protected smaller creatures, shielded nests, and created safe zones for life to flourish. The earliest people saw in this a pattern similar to motherhood. Reeds held the fragile beginnings of life. Ningal, shaped by those reeds, came to embody the same steady protection. Her identity as a mother of gods grew from this early symbolism long before her divine children were born. As myths developed, the House of Reeds became not only a birthplace, but a place of preparation. Ningal learned the rhythms of the world in this sanctuary. She learned how light moved across water, how shadows shifted through the reeds, how the rising and falling of tides affected everything around her. These lessons shaped her approach to divinity. They taught her to guide rather than command, to nurture rather than control, to listen rather than dictate. When she eventually took her place among the celestial deities, she carried this knowledge with her. This natural sanctuary became even more meaningful when the myths described her meeting with Nanna. Their earliest encounters were said to have taken place not in celestial halls, but along the edges of the House of Reeds. This environment framed their connection, giving their union a sense of grounded calm. When they spoke to each other, the water around them reflected their glow, blending the moon's early light with Ningal's soft illumination. Their conversations unfolded in an atmosphere where nothing rushed. The House of Reeds itself seemed to hold their words, as though nature listened to them with the same patience she offered to the world. When Ningal became a mother, the House of Reeds took on new meaning. It became a symbol of the origins of light. People imagined that Utu and Inanna inherited their brilliance from those early days when Ningal absorbed the light reflected on the marsh waters. The House of Reeds, in this interpretation, became a source of radiance. It wasn't a place of darkness. It was a place where light grew naturally, where the moon's glow settled softly, where the sun's first reflections danced on the water. The brightness of her children became an extension of the illumination she gathered in those early moments. The House of Reeds also served as a reminder of the fragility of beginnings. The marshlands were places of balance. Too much water could flood them. Too little could dry them. Reeds depended on a delicate equilibrium, and Ningal's early identity reflected that need for balance. Her nurturing nature grew from an environment that required care, observation, and connection. Her presence in later myths often carried the same sense of equilibrium. She was the goddess who maintained calm when the world shifted, who held things steady when other forces acted with intensity. As human communities grew and began building settlements near the marshes, the House of Reeds influenced how they shaped their religious practices. Early shrines dedicated to Ningal often incorporated materials from the wetlands. Reeds were woven into mats placed on altars. Reed bundles were tied near entrances to temples. Water from marsh springs was poured during rituals to honour her. These practices extended the symbolism of the House of Reeds into daily life, connecting worshippers to the sanctuary where her identity first took form. Even in grand temples built centuries later in cities far from the original marshlands, the House of Reeds remained present in subtle ways. Carvings depicted reeds swaying under moonlight. Hymns referenced the sanctuary where she learned the rhythms of the world. Priests spoke of the House of Reeds as a sacred memory rather than a literal place. It became a symbol of origins, a reminder that divinity did not always need stone walls or towering ziggurats to exist. It could flourish in the quiet places where nature moved slowly. In the laments written during later historical periods, Ningal's connection to the House of Reeds carried emotional weight. When cities fell, when temples were destroyed, when people suffered, poets imagined Ningal remembering the calm sanctuary of her earliest days. They described her longing for the quiet marshlands where life moved without conflict. These laments portrayed her grief not as a reaction of a distant deity, but as the sorrow of a goddess who understood the value of peaceful beginnings. The House of Reeds served as a contrast to the turmoil she witnessed in later eras, highlighting the importance of the calm foundation that shaped her. The sanctuary also became a symbol of resilience. Reeds bend but rarely break. They move with the wind but remain rooted in the earth. This natural quality became tied to Ningal's story. When she faced sorrow or loss in later myths, she responded not with collapse but with quiet perseverance. Her identity echoed the resilience of the reeds that shaped her earliest existence. They taught her how to bend without losing strength, how to endure without becoming rigid. This resilience appeared in her laments, in her prayers, in her presence during times of hardship. As myths spread across cities and generations, the House of Reeds retained its symbolic meaning. It became part of the cultural memory of the people who honoured her. Even those who lived far from marshlands understood the significance of a sanctuary where light, water and life came together in calm harmony. They saw in the House of Reeds a model for how the world could exist at its best. It wasn't grand or imposing. It was steady, quiet, nurturing, just as Ningal was. When scribes wrote detailed descriptions of her temples in later eras, they often included imagery that echoed the House of Reeds. They spoke of rooms filled with soft light, of courtyards designed to allow moonlight to fall gently, of altars surrounded by flowing water. These elements reflected the belief that Ningal's true sanctuary was not made of carved stone, but of natural calm. The grand structures attempted to recreate the atmosphere of her earliest home, reminding worshippers that her identity was rooted in quiet spaces. The House of Reeds also influenced how people thought about divinity itself. It challenged the idea that gods needed dramatic origins. Ningal's beginnings demonstrated that divinity could emerge from simple, steady environments. Her sanctuary wasn't elevated above the world. It was part of the world. It connected the divine to the natural, blending the sacred with the everyday. This perspective shaped how people approached worship. They didn't always need complex rituals to reach her. Sometimes simply sitting beside water under moonlight was enough. Over time, the House of Reeds became a memory carried not just by myth, but by culture. It shaped the way people viewed motherhood, sanctuary, resilience and light. It represented the place where Ningal's identity took shape, where her nurturing strength began, where her influence spread from earth to sky, and even as her story moved into new environments and greater roles, that early sanctuary remained alive in every moment she guided, protected, and illuminated. Moving forward into the next part of her story means carrying the calm of this sanctuary with her, as she steps into realms shaped by devotion, memory, and the steady glow of moonlight that would follow her across ages. As the earliest ages settled into their quiet, steady rhythms, the marshlands that shaped Ningal's earliest presence began to speak in their own way. Not with voices or commands, but with subtle movements that revealed how the world breathed. The ancients believed that these delicate motions carried meaning, that the reeds, the water, and the soft winds shared a kind of language older than any spoken word. To them, Ningal was the one who heard these whispers most clearly. She became known not only for nurturing light and shaping divine radiance, but for listening deeply to the natural world in a way few other deities ever did. In the stories told by the earliest generations, Ningal moved through the marshes with a sensitivity that allowed her to understand even the faintest shifts. She could sense the smallest ripple on the water's surface and know whether it came from a fish gliding beneath or from the changing direction of a distant breeze. She could hear the rustling of reeds and interpret whether they were reacting to the gentle stirrings of life or to a quiet warning carried by the wind. Nothing in the marshlands moved without her awareness. This was not a skill she acquired through power. It was a natural extension of who she was. The marshlands themselves were constantly alive with small motions. The air was filled with the steady hum of insects, the distant calls of birds, the soft lap of water against the roots of reeds. These sounds created a tapestry of gentle noise that the ancients saw as the world's earliest form of communication. For those who lived in these wetlands, survival depended on listening. They learned to distinguish sounds of safety from sounds of danger. They learned to hear changes in water levels, shifts in weather, and movements of animals. This attentiveness became woven into their worldview, and they imagined that their goddess listened with the same care, but with deeper understanding. The story said that Ningal didn't simply hear the world, she responded to it. When reeds bent slightly, she adjusted her steps. When the wind carried the faintest scent of rain, she acknowledged it with a quiet nod. When the marsh waters shifted from stillness to gentle rippling, she paused to take in the meaning. To the ancients, this made her a goddess who didn't rise above the world but moved within it, attuned to the same rhythms that shaped their daily lives. Her ability to listen became the foundation for her later roles. Before she ever became a mother to radiant deities or a consort to the moon god, she learned how to receive the world's needs through attentive presence. The myths described her as patient, never rushing, never pushing. She allowed the marshlands to speak to her, and through that she learned how to nurture. This natural sensitivity eventually influenced how she guided her children and how she interacted with other deities. Her understanding didn't come from distant observation. It came from a lifetime of paying attention. People imagined that even as she rose to prominence in celestial roles, she never lost this connection. They believed she could still hear the shifting marshes regardless of how high she stood among the divine. They thought that the night breezes carried the memories of the wetlands up to her, reminding her of the sanctuary that shaped her earliest nature. Because of this, Ningal became a goddess of attentiveness, one who listened not only to nature, but to the lives of the people who worshipped her. When early communities settled near the waterways, they built their homes with reed walls and floors woven from marsh grasses. Their lives were tied deeply to the movements of water and wind. They were vulnerable to flooding, drought, storms, and shifting river paths. To survive, they listened. And when they needed reassurance that someone beyond their villages understood these delicate rhythms, they called upon Ningal. They saw her as a divine presence who had been listening to the world since the beginning. Her reputation as the goddess who listened shaped how people prayed to her. Unlike some deities who were invoked with loud ceremonies or elaborate sacrifices, Ningal was approached with quiet offerings. Worshippers placed small bowls of water near her altars, symbolizing calm reflection. They laid bundles of reeds before her, representing the sanctuary that shaped her. They lit small lamps not to call her attention forcefully, but to guide her gently. Everything about the way people honoured her reflected the belief that listening was her purest form of power. Priests described her presence during rituals not as dramatic or overwhelming, but as something felt through subtle changes. A shift in air, a softening of shadow, a sense that the night grew slightly warmer. They believed she arrived quietly and listened before responding. This made her one of the most approachable deities in the Sumerian pantheon. People felt that she understood their unspoken concerns, that she could sense their emotions even without grand gestures or elaborate prayers. Over time, the House of Reeds became more than a birthplace. It became a symbol of her ability to listen. The marshlands were always filled with fragile sounds, footsteps on soft ground, wings beating above water, reeds brushing against one another. All of these required a kind of attention that didn't demand but welcomed awareness. Ningal, shaped by these surroundings, learned how to interpret these sounds as lifelines. Later storytellers often emphasized that she listened not because she was searching for signs of danger, but because she honored the delicate existence of all things. This attentiveness shaped her role as protector. She sensed when the marshlands required balance. She perceived when the water levels changed too rapidly, or when the tide carried more force than usual. These shifts weren't threats to her, but signals that the world was adjusting. She met these changes with calm adaptability, the same way the reeds bent with the wind instead of resisting. This quality would become vital in later ages when she grieved for her people during times of destruction. Her ability to listen allowed her to understand the emotional needs of those who called her name in sorrow. Listening formed the core of her identity, influencing how she raised her divine children. Each of them had a different kind of radiance, a different path, a different presence. Utu carried the bright strength of the sun. Inanna held a vibrant, shifting light that changed with her actions. Nanna embodied the slow, steady rhythm of the lunar cycle. Ningal guided each of them by observing their needs, not by demanding roles. The myths often portrayed her watching her children with the same attentiveness that she once gave the marshlands. She understood when Utu needed encouragement, when Inanna needed guidance, and when Nanna needed reassurance. Her nurturing was rooted in awareness. This trait made her invaluable in divine councils. While other gods acted quickly or with dominant strength, Ningal brought clarity through her understanding of subtle details. She noticed things that others overlooked. She sensed shifts in divine dynamics. She interpreted the meaning behind silence. Her perspective often helped maintain balance among deities with more forceful personalities. Even though she didn't wield weapons or command storms, her influence shaped the outcome of many divine decisions simply because she understood the world with a depth that came from listening. As civilizations expanded, the marshlands changed. Canals were built. Settlements grew. The silent spaces of the House of Reeds were altered by human activity. But the myths preserved them as a sacred memory. Priests retold the stories of Ningal's early years, describing the sanctuary with a reverence that kept its significance alive. Even when people no longer lived in reed houses, they remembered the sounds of the marshlands that shaped their goddess. They told their children that Ningal listened to the softest movements of the world, just as she listened to them. This belief carried into the laments written in her voice. When Ningal mourned the fall of her beloved city, her sorrow was shaped by her ability to hear suffering. She listened to the cries of the displaced, the silence of empty homes, the distant echoes of once lively streets. Her grief reflected the attentiveness she embodied since her earliest days. She didn't mourn because she witnessed destruction. She mourned because she heard it deeply. In this way, listening became a form of strength. It allowed her to remain present even when the world shifted painfully. It enabled her to understand the patterns of loss and recovery. It taught her how to guide her people through hardship. The marshlands, with their constant movement and quiet resilience, gave her the foundation to navigate these moments with calm determination. Her reputation for listening also made her a goddess of guidance. People didn't ask her to change the course of events dramatically. They asked her to help them understand what they could not see or interpret. Farmers prayed to her for signs of shifts in weather. Mothers prayed to her for comfort when their children were unsettled. Travellers prayed to her for insight when the paths became uncertain. She offered clarity, not through declarations, but through subtle instinct, through quiet assurance. This listening also extended to the cosmos. The ancients believed she heard the rhythms of the sky as clearly as she heard the marshlands. She sensed the movement of stars, the changing brightness of the moon, the progression of the sun's path. Her celestial family carried these rhythms into their roles, guided by her understanding of time and light. She listened to the sky the way she listened to the earth, perceiving balance between both realms. The House of Reeds, over time, became a symbol of this duality. It represented her earthly origins, but also reflected her celestial influence. The reeds stood rooted in water, while their tops swayed under the open sky. This mirrored Ningal herself, grounded in the calm sanctuary of the marshlands while guiding the luminous cycles of the heavens. She remained connected to both worlds, listening to the whispers of nature and the distant movements of celestial light. As her story continued through centuries of worship, her identity as the goddess who listened never diminished. It only deepened. People remembered her not just as the mother of radiant gods, but as a figure who understood the world's subtle messages. They believed she could hear emotions not expressed, thoughts not spoken, and hopes not yet formed. Her attentiveness made her a compassionate presence in the divine realm, someone who stood beside her people through every change. This quality followed her into every temple dedicated to her. Even in the grand structures where priests chanted elaborate hymns, there was always a moment of quiet set aside for her. These moments reminded worshippers that Ningal did not require noise to hear them. She listened in silence as naturally as reeds listen to the wind. No matter how large the temple or how distant the marshlands had become, the memory of her sanctuary remained central. Her ability to listen shaped not only her divine identity, but also how people approached their own understanding of the world. They learned from her that strength could come from attention, that wisdom could come from observing the natural rhythms around them, and that guidance often grew from listening rather than acting quickly. Through her, they understood that the world spoke constantly, if one only paid attention to the subtle tones. As her presence continues into the next part of her story, the memory of those marshland whispers remains with her, a foundation of calm awareness that guides each new movement of her journey. As the world shifted from its quiet beginnings and the early centuries gave way to new ages of structure, the movements of Ningal began to stretch beyond the marshlands that shaped her earliest nature. What started as a life intertwined with reeds and moonlit waters slowly expanded toward the growing settlements that dotted the edges of the southern plains. These small communities, built from the same materials as the wetlands, began to transform into villages, towns, and eventually the first cities that humanity would ever know. Through this unfolding transformation, Ningal's presence did not drift away from her origins. Instead, she followed the people who settled along the waterways, guiding them with the same steady calm that had shaped her earliest identity. The shift from marsh sanctuary to urban dwelling did not occur abruptly. It unfolded over generations through gradual movements, families building their homes closer together, farmers organizing their fields, traders establishing paths along the rivers. As these changes took place, people continued to see Ningal as the divine presence who understood the rhythms of the natural world. They believed her attentiveness extended beyond the reeds and the moonlit shallows. She could listen to the world's new movements just as deeply as she once listened to the world's earliest whispers. This belief made her a bridge between the old environment and the developing cities. The journey she made in myth from marshlands to cities mirrored the transformation that humans experienced in their daily lives. In those early days, the ancient people saw no conflict in imagining their goddess walking through areas where nature and civilization intertwined. They imagined her still moving over soft ground, still accompanied by the glow of the moon, even as she passed between the first small structures made of mud brick and reed walls. People built their earlier shrines to her with materials that honoured her origins. They used reeds to form the walls, water from marsh springs to purify the space, and moonlight as the central illumination. These shrines were humble, but they carried the same calm atmosphere as the House of Reeds. Over time, as communities expanded and new architectural forms developed, these shrines grew into more permanent structures. Yet even as temples became larger, Ningal's presence remained tied to the quiet spaces within them. Priests described her dwelling places as calm rooms filled with soft light, as though the sanctuary preserved the atmosphere of her earliest home, no matter how grand the outer walls became. People entered these spaces expecting to feel the same steady presence that had shaped her path through the marshlands. Her journey into the great cities began in places like Eridu and Uruk, where early settlements began developing into the first urban centres. The myths describe Ningal moving through these spaces not as a goddess who imposed change, but as one who observed and supported the slow development of civilization. She remained attentive to the needs of the people, just as she had been attentive to the needs of the marshlands. This trait made her a divine presence who didn't resist the shifts taking place. She moved with them, guiding communities through the new rhythms that city life introduced. As these settlements continued to grow, they developed canals, markets, and public gathering spaces. The rivers that fed the marshlands became sources of irrigation and transportation. People began to rely heavily on the cycles of light and water for farming, trade, and daily life. Ningal's role deepened during this time because the radiances she brought into the world shaped the rhythms of civilization. The moon guided the movement of tides and timekeeping. The sun marked seasons and work cycles. The morning star influenced agricultural timing. These celestial elements, born from her nurturing, became essential tools for early societies. The people believed that Ningal walked beside them as they built these early cities, offering quiet guidance through the cycles of light. They saw her presence in the glow that fell on newly constructed walls, in the soft illumination of city streets at night, in the steady rise of daylight that supported their labour. Her children brought these celestial rhythms into structured roles, but Ningal remained the figure who ensured that these lights were steady enough for human life to flourish. Her influence became more pronounced when she settled in Ur, the city that would one day become one of the most important centres of Mesopotamian civilization. Ur's location near marshland made it a perfect convergence of her origins and the new world forming around her. Here, the people built some of the earliest temples dedicated to Nanna and Ningal, structures that grew slowly from reed sanctuaries into monumental institutions. Yet even as the architecture soared upward, Ningal's presence remained grounded in calm, quiet spaces within the temple complex. Her movement into these growing cities brought with it a sense of continuity. People saw her as the goddess who linked their early marshland heritage to their emerging urban identity. She didn't replace the House of Reeds with rigid stone walls. Instead, the great cities preserved her early symbolism, incorporating dry reeds into decorative elements, placing water features in temple courtyards, and designing spaces that allowed moonlight to reach inner sanctums. This integration ensured that Ningal's identity remained connected to her origins even as her presence expanded into new realms. The journey she made also reflected the Sumerian belief that civilization required balance. As cities grew, they faced new challenges, managing water systems, organizing labor, maintaining social harmony. Many deities became associated with specific aspects of city life, such as justice, craft, or fertility. Ningal's role, however, remained more subtle. She guided communities not by overseeing specific activities, but by embodying the calm awareness that these early societies required. Her influence encouraged balance between expansion and stability, between innovation and tradition, between the rhythms of nature and the structures of human endeavour. This influence was particularly evident in the daily practices of the temples that honoured her. Priests recorded observations of the moon's behaviour, noting changes in brightness, timing and position. These observations informed agricultural practices, festival calendars, and omen interpretations. Ningal's connection to the moon made these practices deeply symbolic. People believed she helped ensure that the moon's movements remained stable and meaningful, guiding their activities through celestial rhythms that felt both natural and divine. Her journey into the cities also shaped how other deities interacted with her. Nanna's prominence grew as cities expanded, but Ningal remained beside him, seen as the gentle presence who kept the moon god grounded. The myths portrayed her as someone who understood the emotional currents of the divine realm just as she understood the natural currents of the marshlands. Her attentiveness allowed her to perceive shifts among the deities that others overlooked. This made her a valuable figure in maintaining harmony within the divine family that shaped the heavens. As cities continued to grow, people began travelling greater distances to trade goods and share knowledge. Merchants followed the moonlight on long journeys, using its glow to navigate unfamiliar landscapes. They viewed this illumination as the guidance of Ningal, believing she watched over them as they moved far from home. Her presence became a source of comfort for those who travelled through quiet nights across open plains or along winding rivers. They saw her not only as a goddess of marshland origins, but as a companion through the ever-expanding world. Her reputation as a listener also extended into city life. People believed she could hear the emotional tones of urban communities just as clearly as she once heard the natural tones of the marshlands. They prayed to her for guidance when conflicts arose, when households faced difficulties, when the city endured changes that felt uncertain. She offered reassurance not through loud declarations, but through the steady continuity of the moon's glow. Worshippers felt her presence most strongly during the quiet hours of early morning or late night, when the city rested and the calmness of her nature seemed to drift through the streets. The rise of marked the height of her influence. This city became a centre of devotion, where her presence was honoured alongside Nanna's in a vast temple complex that reflected her journey from natural sanctuary to urban prominence. Yet the temple's most sacred spaces always carried the atmosphere of the House of Reeds. These areas were designed to be quiet and reflective, often featuring pools of water, reed imagery, and open ceilings that allowed moonlight to fall directly onto altars. Worshippers believed this maintained the connection between her earliest home and her central role in the city. The expansion of civilization didn't diminish the symbolism of her origins. Instead, it enhanced it. People saw Ningal as the goddess who accompanied them through every step of their development. She didn't withdraw as cities grew. She guided their evolution, ensuring they remained connected to the calm rhythms of the natural world. Each new structure, each new canal, each new ritual carried echoes of her early presence. The House of Reeds lived on in every quiet courtyard, every moonlit ceremony, every prayer whispered in the stillness of night. Although the journey brought her into environments filled with noise and movement, she remained a figure of calm awareness. She didn't lose the qualities shaped by the marshlands. She carried them into the cities, reminding people that their origins were rooted in quiet places. Her presence encouraged a sense of stability, a reminder that growth didn't have to abandon gentleness. Civilization, in her influence, could be steady and nurturing rather than overwhelming or chaotic. Her presence also shaped how people viewed the relationship between the divine and the built environment. Cities were not spaces separate from the divine realm. They were extensions of the early sanctuary where she first walked. The canals mirrored the marsh waters. The reed mats in homes reflected her origins. The quiet spaces in temples echoed the atmosphere she carried with her. People wove her symbolism into their daily lives without forcing it. It became a natural part of their cultural identity. Even in the later eras, when empires rose and fell, and cities grew and crumbled, Ningal's influence persisted. Her name continued to appear in prayers and hymns long after many other deities faded from memory. This endurance came not from dramatic interventions, but from the sense of comfort she offered through changing times. People saw her as a goddess who understood both the softness of beginnings and the complexities of civilization. She listened to the world in all its forms, reassuring her people that the quiet strength she embodied remained present. As her journey through the great cities continued, she became more than a symbol of marshland origins or celestial nurturing. She became a guardian of continuity, guiding civilizations through their transformations while preserving the gentle foundation that shaped her identity. Each new environment she entered carried traces of her earlier sanctuary, and her presence remained one of calm resilience, guiding people with the same steady patience that once moved through the whispering reeds of the ancient marshlands. As the great cities rose from the plains and the world entered eras where stone, brick and memory intertwined, Ningal's presence found new expression in the sacred spaces that humanity built to honour the divine. The marshlands where she once listened to the world had shaped her earliest identity, but as people gathered into growing urban centres, they carried her calm into structures designed not only to shelter worship, but to preserve the atmosphere of her presence. These new sanctuaries were made from clay baked in hot sunlight and decorated with silver gleam that echoed the moon's glow. They became places where her name drifted softly through courtyards at dusk, where the memory of the House of Reeds lived on in transformed form. The earliest temples dedicated to Ningal were modest structures built near waterways. Their walls were formed from mud brick mixed with straw, grounded in the same earth that once held the reeds she walked among. They were not meant to rise above the landscape, but to blend into it, providing a sheltered space where priests and worshippers could honour her in ways that echoed her origins. These humble temples were described as having open roofs, allowing moonlight to fall directly onto altars. The light was not an addition to the ritual, it was part of the ritual itself. The glow of the moon symbolised the gentle presence that defined Ningal's identity. As generations passed and the architecture of the region became more refined, these early temples expanded. Some grew into complexes large enough to hold courtyards, storerooms, ceremonial rooms and raised platforms. But even as they grew, they kept a sense of calm rooted in her earliest days. Architects and priests designed them to carry an atmosphere that reflected the sanctuary where she first listened to the world. They ensured that silence played a role in the rituals, that spaces existed where worshippers could sit with her presence without the noise of daily life. These temples became transitional zones between the busyness of cities and the quiet of her divine nature. The material most commonly associated with her temples was clay. It was everywhere in Mesopotamia, beneath homes, beneath roads, beneath the earlier settlements. Clay carried the softness of the earth, the weight of history, and the potential for shaping. It was a material that responded to touch, that could be formed gently, that held imprints of hands long after they were lifted. This resonated deeply with Ningal's nurturing identity. Priests spoke of clay as a reminder of the early world that shaped her. Clay tablets carried hymns praising her listening ear. Clay vessels stored offerings dedicated to her. Clay bricks formed the walls of her sanctuaries. In every temple crafted from this humble material, the people saw reflections of the goddess who shaped life through gentleness rather than force. The silver associated with her came not from mines but from the glow of the moon. It represented light that had softened in the night sky, light that comforted rather than blinded. Silver was used sparingly in temples dedicated to her, not as a symbol of wealth, but as a symbolic echo of lunar radiance. A thin line of silver might edge a ceremonial bowl. A silver disc might rest atop a sacred pedestal. Some temples placed polished silver mirrors where moonlight could reflect onto offerings. These reflective surfaces allowed the temple rooms to carry the same gentle illumination that defined the marshlands where Ningal first walked. Worshippers didn't interpret silver as luxury. They saw it as a material that responded to light the way she responded to the world's rhythms. The time of day most associated with Ningal was dusk. This moment, when sunlight softened into evening and the first hints of moonlight appeared, felt like the boundary between worlds. Dusk carried the lingering warmth of day and the gentle promise of night. It was neither bright nor dark, neither fully active nor fully restful. In this transitional hour, people believed her presence was strongest. It was when the marshlands had once quieted into a soft chorus of whispers. It was when the moon began its rise. It was when cities paused just for a moment before lamps were lit and the night's rhythms began. Worshippers gathered in her temples during these quiet hours, speaking her name in tones that matched the softness of the sky. They offered reeds, recalling her sanctuary. They offered water, symbolizing the marshes. They offered small lamps, evoking the glow she carried. These rituals were not elaborate or demanding. They were gentle gestures meant to harmonize with her nature. People didn't come to her temples seeking dramatic intervention. They came seeking calm, reassurance, continuity, and a sense of being heard. In Ur, the city that became her most important centre of devotion, the temple dedicated to Nanna and Ningal grew into one of the largest religious institutions of the age. Yet within this massive structure, her influence remained concentrated in quiet spaces designed specifically for her. These rooms were intentionally separated from the noise of public rituals. Water features within the complex echoed the sound of the marshlands. Reed mats covered floors, keeping her earlier sanctuary close. Priests tended to lamps that burned with steady flame, believing the light honoured her role in shaping the celestial radiance that guided their lives. Many hymns written for her reflected the importance of these temple spaces. They described how moonlight entered through openings in the ceiling, resting on her altar, as though the sky itself acknowledged her presence. They spoke of how worshippers felt a sense of comfort in the stillness of her rooms. Some hymns even described the subtle shift in atmosphere that people felt when dusk settled in, as though Ningal herself moved softly through the temple halls. These writings emphasized that her temples were not just places of worship. They were sanctuaries where the world slowed down enough for her presence to be felt. Priests dedicated to her developed rituals that mirrored the rhythms she embodied. They recorded changes in lunar brightness, interpreted subtle atmospheric shifts, and maintained altars with precision that reflected her attentiveness. Their work wasn't dramatic, but required patience and care. They viewed their duties as extensions of her own listening, believing that maintaining the temple's calm atmosphere was a sacred responsibility. Through these practices, temples dedicated to Ningal became centres of observation, reflection, and steady devotion. Her influence within these sacred spaces also shaped how people understood their daily lives. The connection between silver, clay, and dusk became part of their cultural identity. Clay represented stability. Silver symbolized gentle light. Dusk embodied transition. Together, they framed a worldview grounded in balance. People didn't see divinity as something separate from their environment. They saw it in the materials they built with, the light they lived under, and the quiet hours that bookended their days. Ningal's presence brought meaning to these elements, turning them into symbols of calm and continuity. Travellers who journeyed between cities often sought her temples for rest. They believed these spaces served as way stations where the stresses of long travel softened. Priests welcomed them with water and food, reflecting the hospitality associated with her. These travellers often described feeling a sense of relief upon entering her sanctuaries. They felt as though they were stepping into a place where the world slowed, where the noise of urban life faded, where the presence of a listening goddess eased their burdens. For many, her temples became essential destinations on long routes between regions. Over time, the connection between Ningal and dusk became so strong that people developed a daily practice of speaking her name as the sun descended. They whispered prayers during the fading light, asking for calm, for clarity, for guidance through the coming night. These prayers were simple and personal. They didn't require elaborate offerings. They required presence. People believed that speaking softly at dusk allowed their voices to blend with the subtle tones of the natural world she once listened to in the reeds. This ritual anchored her presence in the rhythms of human life. Her temples also played a role in maintaining cultural continuity. In times of political change, when rulers rose and fell, when the structure of cities shifted, Ningal's sanctuaries remained places where people felt grounded. Even when dynasties changed or conflicts threatened stability, her temples carried the same atmosphere of peace that had shaped her from the beginning. They were places where the world outside might change rapidly, but inside the calm remained. This stability made her temples essential pillars of community identity. In many accounts, the Temple of held ceremonies that honoured her role as mother of radiant deities. During these ceremonies, priests lit lamps at dusk in a precise sequence, each flame representing one of her children. These lights were arranged to reflect the pattern of the night sky. The illumination filled the temple with a soft glow that reflected the celestial cycle she helped create. People attending these rituals often described them as moments of deep stillness, where time seemed to slow and the boundary between the divine and the human world grew thin. Even in later periods, when new empires rose and older traditions faded, Ningal's temples remained significant. Some were rebuilt, some expanded, some partially forgotten, yet they all carried the same core symbolism: silver and clay, moonlight and stillness, dusk and resilience. These elements kept her presence alive in the collective memory of the people. They reminded communities that their origins were shaped by gentleness, that their strength came from balance, and that the world's rhythms were most meaningful when listened to carefully. The great cities, despite their noise and movement, never lost their connection to the quiet goddess who followed them from the marshlands. Her temples ensured that even the busiest environments held spaces for calm reflection. As people moved through their daily lives, they knew that somewhere within the city walls, a sanctuary existed where Ningal's presence lingered in the silver shimmer of moonlight on clay, where her name was spoken softly at dusk, and where her gentle influence continued to guide their civilization through each passing age. From here, her story moves deeper into the places where memory and devotion intertwine, carrying her presence from temples into the emotional heart of her people, where echoes of her name continue to live in stone, in ritual, and in the quiet moments of evening that connected generations across time. As the centuries settled into layers of memory and the great cities of Mesopotamia rose to heights that would later astonish the world, Ningal's presence remained a quiet thread woven through the unfolding story. Her temples glowed at dusk with silver light. Her name drifted through the reeds and the courtyards. Her sanctuary preserved the calm rhythm of her earliest days. Yet even the most enduring symbols of stability eventually felt the weight of time. Civilizations that grew steadily under her watch would one day falter, and the cities she nurtured with her calm resilience would experience moments of deep sorrow. The people who whispered her name in peace would come to whisper it in loss. The fall of became one of the most defining moments in her long mythic journey. This city, which had carried her presence with the same reverence it offered the moon itself, faced destruction brought by forces beyond the control of its people. For generations, had been a place where her temple stood quietly at the centre of communal life. It was a place where families prayed for guidance, where travellers found rest, where moonlit ceremonies honoured her nurturing influence. But even these sacred rituals could not shield the city from the tides of conflict that swept through the region. When the city began to fall, the hymns written by ancient poets captured not only the physical destruction, but the emotional devastation felt by those who lived there. One of the most haunting laments in human history emerged from this moment, written in the voice of Ningal herself. The lament didn't portray her as a goddess of unstoppable power. It portrayed her as a mother grieving for her city. A mother who had listened to the world since the earliest days now listened to the cries of her people as their homes crumbled. Her sorrow was described with quiet intensity, echoing the stillness of the marshlands that shaped her, now transformed into a grief that settled heavily across the ruins. The lament described her pleading with higher gods, asking them to spare the city. Her words were gentle, woven with the same patience she always showed, yet filled with desperation. She begged them to reconsider, to allow the city time to heal, to protect the people who had honoured her name for generations, but the Divine Council did not yield. The destruction unfolded despite her pleas, and the imagery of the lament showed her walking through the ruined streets, hearing the silence that replaced the once vibrant life of... Her grief was rooted in the attentiveness that defined her earliest identity. She didn't grieve from a distance. She moved through the destruction with the same sensitivity she once used to interpret the whispering tides. She heard the absence of life more clearly than the noise of collapse. The lament described her wandering the empty courtyards of her temple, touching the broken walls with quiet sorrow, listening to the fading echoes of prayers that once filled the air. The sanctuary that had carried her presence was now shattered, yet her connection to it remained, deepened by loss. The fall of marked the beginning of her exile, not a banishment by divine decree, but a wandering shaped by grief. Ningal became a goddess without a resting place, her presence moving through lands altered by conflict and impermanence. The stories described her leaving the ruins of her temple quietly, carrying nothing but her sorrow. She followed the rivers that once fed the marshlands. She passed through villages struggling to rebuild. She drifted along the paths the survivors travelled as they sought new homes. Her wandering was not a retreat from her people. It was a continuation of her nurturing presence, a determination to remain with those who needed her even in exile. Her identity during these wandering years shifted subtly. She was still the mother of radiant deities, still the goddess who listened to the world, still the calm presence shaped by reeds and moonlight. But now she also carried the sorrow of a collapsed kingdom. Her grief became part of her divine nature, described in hymns and oral traditions as a quiet weight that shaped her movements. People saw in her a goddess who understood the fragility of life, who had felt the sorrow of losing a home, who continued to offer guidance despite the loss. Communities displaced by the fall of Ur brought her name with them as they resettled in new lands. They carried fragments of her temple traditions. They carried reed mats, silver charms, and small clay tablets, etched with prayers that had once been recited at dusk. These items became symbols of continuity, reminders of the sanctuary they had lost. They believed that Ningal followed them, listening to their struggles as they rebuilt their lives. Her wandering presence comforted them, offering quiet assurance that her attention remained constant even as the world shifted beneath their feet. In some traditions, her exile was described as a journey through the edges of civilization. She visited small settlements where people still lived close to nature. She walked through fields where farmers cultivated crops with the same dependence on light and water that shaped her earliest days. She rested near rivers whose currents echoed the whispers of the marshlands. These wanderings allowed her to remain connected to the earth, to hear its subtle movements, to maintain the attentiveness that defined her. Over time, her presence influenced the development of new communities. People built small shrines along the paths she was believed to have travelled. These shrines were often made from clay and decorated with reed bundles. They served as reminders that she moved among them, offering quiet protection. Some shrines placed reflective surfaces to catch moonlight, symbolising her connection to the lunar radiance that guided travellers during their long journeys. Others included water basins that reflected the sanctuary she once called home. Even as her exile continued, her reputation as a compassionate goddess grew. People looked to her not for dramatic intervention, but for emotional endurance. They believed she understood suffering deeply because she had experienced it herself. Her laments over Ur became part of the cultural memory, recited in times of hardship not as stories of divine defeat, but as testimonies of resilience. The laments portrayed a goddess who mourned with her people, not from a place of detachment, but from shared grief. This shared sorrow strengthened the bond between Ningal and the communities who honoured her. In rebuilding their lives, they found comfort in the idea that even a goddess could experience loss and continue to offer guidance. Her exile reflected the uncertainty of their own lives. Her wandering presence mirrored the journeys of refugees who sought safety in new lands. Her quiet endurance became a source of inspiration, showing that even in moments of devastation, calm strength could persist. As centuries passed, the memory of her exile became woven into rituals. Dusk prayers reflected not only her role as a goddess of gentle transitions, but also her journey through darkness and loss. Worshippers spoke her name softly in the fading light, believing that the calm of dusk resonated with the calm she carried through her sorrow. They imagined her listening to their prayers with the same attentiveness she once gave the marshlands, offering understanding rather than immediate solutions. Her wandering also influenced how people perceived the divine presence in the changing world. They no longer saw goddesses and gods as distant figures confined to grand structures. They believed divinity could walk through ruined streets, could share in the suffering of displaced people, could wander through landscapes altered by the passage of time. Ningal's exile softened the boundary between the divine and the human experience. Her story suggested that care and attentiveness could remain even when structures fell. The myths described her eventual approach to other cities, where she offered her presence quietly without expecting recognition. She drifted into temples that had never known her shrine but welcomed her presence as a gentle addition to their rituals. In these places she did not claim new roles. She brought her calm, her listening, her resilience. Some cities adopted her as a secondary goddess, associated with dusk, motherhood, or lunar radiance. Others created small altars to honour her grief, acknowledging the sorrow she carried from Her presence during these wandering years shaped her children as well. Nanna, Utu, and Inanna continued their roles in the celestial realm, but the myths described them watching over her with concern, ensuring she remained connected to the divine currents, even as she walked through earthly landscapes. This connection between divine family and wandering goddess showed that her sorrow did not diminish her importance. Instead, it deepened the emotional resonance of her myth. In some traditions, her exile came to an end when new temples were built to honour her in regions far from These temples were smaller than the grand structures she once knew, but they carried the calm atmosphere she required. They included shaded courtyards, water features, and open ceilings that allowed moonlight to fall directly onto altars. These sanctuaries became places where people honoured both her nurturing identity and her resilience. They recited the laments as part of their rituals, ensuring that her sorrow remained part of the cultural memory. Her story during this era reflected the broader cycles of civilization. Cities rose, fell, and rose again. People built new homes, new canals, new shrines. Through all these changes, Ningal's presence remained a quiet guide. She was not a goddess tied to a single city or era. She was a presence that moved with her people, listening to their needs, sharing their sorrow, and offering calm strength as they rebuilt. Her exile also emphasized the importance of memory in her myth. The fall of did not erase her presence, it deepened it. The House of Reeds remained part of her identity, but now so did the ruined streets of her beloved city. Her earlier sanctuary shaped her gentleness. Her exile shaped her resilience. Both aspects combined to create a multi-layered presence that resonated deeply with worshippers across generations. As her story continues, her journey leads her from exile into places where memory becomes legacy, where the echoes of her name carry through time, and where her presence endures long after kingdoms crumble and new eras rise in their place. As ages turned and the memory of ancient kingdoms slipped into the quiet layers of history, the presence of Ningal lived on not through monuments alone, but through the stories that softened into place wherever moonlight touched the world. Her temples in though shattered, did not silence her name. Her gentle guidance continued to drift across generations in the tales people whispered during the cool hours of the night, when the moon rose high above their homes and washed the land in the same soft light that once illuminated the marshlands of her earlier sanctuary. These myths, preserved through centuries of transformation and hardship, carried the subtle echoes of her touch, reminding people that even when kingdoms fell, the presence of a listening goddess endured. The stories that circulated about her in the aftermath of her wandering years often centred on how she continued to watch over the world, from the quiet spaces between dusk and darkness. People believed that the moonlight held remnants of her comforting touch, that the silver glow spread across rooftops and rivers carried something of her earliest nature. These beliefs shaped how her myths evolved, turning her presence into something felt rather than seen. In the soft illumination that followed nightfall, worshippers sensed a calm that reminded them of the goddess who had listened to the world long before cities ever rose. Many of the myths that survived from this period were not written in the grand style of royal inscriptions or temple decrees. They were carried orally by families, by travellers resting under open skies, by priests performing dusk rituals in small village shrines. These narratives often began with the glow of moonlight as an entry point, as though the light itself held the memory of her gentle presence. People used the moon as a reminder of her touch, believing that the celestial glow was an extension of her nurturing. It made the night feel less daunting, offering comfort and stillness to those living in uncertain times. One story told of a small settlement that had endured drought, where the rivers pulled away from their banks and the fields dried into brittle earth. The people, no longer able to rely on the guidance of the celestial cycles as they once had, gathered each evening to watch for the rise of the moon. In these moments, they whispered her name, hoping for reassurance. According to the tale, on one of these nights, a faint shift in the wind carried cool air through the village, and the moonlight grew brighter just before the rains returned. The people believed this change came from Ningal listening to their unspoken pleas. They felt her presence in the wind, the moonlight, and the soft patter of the first drops of rain. The story became a reminder that even in hardship, a quiet, divine awareness watched over them. Another tale described how the moonlight lingered over the ruins of long after the city had fallen. Travellers passing by the once great walls often commented on the strange stillness that filled the air at night. They said the moonlight seemed to settle more heavily in places where her temple once stood, as though the glow remembered the sacred rituals that had taken place there. These travellers claimed to feel an unexplainable calm when walking through the ruins at dusk. They believed Ningal's sorrow had settled into the stones themselves, and that her presence continued to watch over the city even after its destruction. This belief helped preserve her connection to ensuring that her identity remained alive in the memory of the land even as new civilizations rose from the remnants. Stories also emerged describing how Ningal comforted individuals during moments of personal sorrow. One tale spoke of a young mother who lost her child and wandered into the night seeking solace. According to the myth, she followed the moonlight until she reached a quiet grove where reeds rustled softly in the wind. There, she felt a gentle presence wrap around her, not with words but with the same calm she'd known since childhood whenever she prayed at Ningal's shrine. The woman believed that the goddess had come to her, offering comfort in her grief. She returned home with renewed strength, telling others that Ningal's touch could still be felt even far from the great cities and their temples. Over time, this story spread, teaching people that the goddess who had mourned her own city understood sorrow deeply and responded to it with quiet compassion. These tales reflected the enduring belief that Ningal's presence was most strongly felt in the moments between light and darkness, in the hours when silence carried layers of meaning. Dusk rituals in her honour became more intimate during these ages, often conducted by families rather than formal priesthoods. People gathered at the edges of their homes or at small shrines to speak her name softly, believing that even the faintest whisper reached her. They didn't call her to intervene forcefully. They spoke to her because they believed she understood. The myths that focused on her listening nature remained particularly strong. They described her ability to hear the smallest shifts in the world, whether they came from the marshlands, from the heart of a troubled city, or from the quiet sorrow of an individual. This attentiveness made her a figure people turned to when they felt unseen. They imagined her moving through the night with a presence that soothed without demanding attention. Her touch was subtle, felt in soft breezes or in the gentle glow of moonlight on water. These stories reinforced her role as a goddess who guided not through control but through understanding. In some regions, myths arose describing how she wandered the night sky as a luminous presence beyond the reach of the naked eye. They said she walked behind the moon, leaving faint trails of light that sometimes appeared as halos or subtle shimmers. People believed these trails were signs that she continued to watch over the world from her celestial path. These myths grew particularly strong in areas where the marshlands had long since dried or shifted, as they offered a way for communities far from her origins to feel connected to her. Other stories described how she comforted the spirits of the deceased, guiding them toward rest with the same calm she offered the living. These tales emphasized her nurturing qualities, portraying her as a guardian who ensured that no soul wandered alone in the darkness. People believed that at the moment of death, the soft glow that sometimes appeared in the corner of a room was a sign that she had arrived to accompany the departing spirit. This belief shaped funeral rituals, where families lit small lamps or placed water near the body to honour her presence. These practices carried forward her association with light and stillness, reinforcing her role in providing comfort during transitions. The moonlight myths associated with her grew richer as centuries passed. Some spoke of how she shaped the glow itself, adjusting its brightness to reflect the needs of the world. When nights felt too dark, she was said to increase the moon's radiance just slightly, offering reassurance. When the world required rest, she allowed the moonlight to soften, encouraging sleep. These stories portrayed her as part of the nightly rhythm that shaped human experience, a presence woven into the cycles of rest and activity. People also believed that she guided dreams. They imagined that as the moonlight entered homes through windows and doorways, it carried her touch with it, creating a gentle environment where dreams could take shape without distress. They placed this belief into small rituals, such as placing reeds near the bed, or sleeping with a bowl of water nearby to reflect the moonlight. These objects reminded them of her earlier sanctuary, connecting their personal lives to the natural environment that had shaped her. Myths from later ages often blended her marshland origins with her celestial role, portraying her as a figure who drifted between earth and sky. They described her moving across the world with a dual presence, grounded in the natural rhythms of water and reeds, yet elevated in the gentle glow of the night sky. This duality made her accessible to people from many regions. Those who lived near rivers felt her presence in the water. Those who lived in deserts felt it in the coolness of the moonlight. Those who lived in bustling cities felt it in the quiet courtyards where shadows softened as the sun descended. In these stories, Ningal's touch symbolized more than comfort. It represented continuity. She carried the memory of ancient times into new eras, ensuring that the essence of early civilizations remained alive in subtle ways. The myths emphasized that her presence did not diminish even when temples crumbled or kingdoms vanished. Instead, it adapted. It found new forms. It reached people through moonlight, wind, water, and quiet reflection. Her identity became not just a relic of ancient belief, but a living presence that shaped how people experienced the night. Some stories told of how she sometimes appeared in distant places, not in physical form, but through signs that evoked her earlier sanctuary. A sudden rustling of reeds in areas where none grew, a faint shimmer on water under a moonlit sky, a moment of stillness that felt deliberate. These gentle signs reminded people that she moved freely through the world, responding to moments where her presence was needed most. They saw her as a goddess who chose not to distance herself from human experience, but to remain near, offering calm guidance through the small details of life. These myths also influenced how people understood time. The cycles of the moon became not just a measure of days and months, but a symbol of her steady presence. Each phase carried meaning. When the moon was full, they believed her nurturing presence was strongest. When it waned, they thought she was resting, listening carefully to the world's needs before returning with renewed radiance. These interpretations shaped festivals, rituals, and daily practices, embedding her identity into the rhythm of life. In some traditions, the waxing crescent became a symbol of hope, pointing toward her gentle expansion of light. The waning crescent became a symbol of reflection, reminding people to look inward. These interpretations reflected her influence over emotional and spiritual life as much as over the physical cycles of the night sky. The moon's phases became mirrors of Ningal's nurturing presence, guiding people through the changing seasons of their own lives. As these myths spread, her touch became part of the cultural imagination. People painted her image on ceramics, carved symbols associated with her into amulets, and wrote poems that reflected the calm she embodied. In some households, parents told their children that the soft glow on their faces as they slept was Ningal watching over them. These stories gave comfort and shaped how people understood the relationship between the divine and the everyday. Her presence became not something distant and awe-inspiring, but something familiar and reassuring. Through all these stories, Ningal's identity endured with a sense of quiet persistence. Her influence didn't rely on spectacle or force. It lived in the subtle details of the world, in the soft movements of light and wind, in the emotional rhythms of human life. The myths that remembered her touch carried the tone of the goddess herself, gentle, steady, observant, woven into the fabric of existence with a tenderness that never demanded attention, yet always made itself felt. As her story moves into later eras, these echoes continue to shape her presence across time, carrying her identity into new narratives, new environments, and new understandings of the divine that kept her memory alive long after the marshlands and great cities shifted into distant history. As centuries deepened into millennia, and the ancient memory of Ningal drifted across cultures that rose and fell like the tidal rhythms she once followed, her presence began to move into a different kind of realm. No longer held solely in temples or whispered rituals at dusk, her name began to appear in the world of scholars, first in the quiet hands of historians who brushed dust from clay tablets, and later in the conversations of skeptics, researchers, travellers, and thinkers who tried to understand how a goddess of reed sanctuaries and moonlit halls could slip so gently into obscurity. It was a curious transition for a deity who once shaped the emotional heart of a civilization, and yet, in many ways, it reflected her nature perfectly. She did not demand to be remembered. She simply allowed her memory to drift, like moonlight on slow-moving water, waiting for those who listened carefully to find her again. The first scholars to rediscover her name lived thousands of years after her temples thrived. They worked not in the courtyards of Ur or on the reed mats of early sanctuaries, but in excavation sites scattered across the modern landscape, kneeling beneath the heat of the sun while sifting through earth that had held centuries of forgotten worlds. They found fragments of clay tablets etched with cuneiform symbols, tablets that carried hymns dedicated to deities whose names had slept beneath layers of time. Among these fragments were lines that spoke of Ningal, lines that described her as the Lady of the Reeds, the mother of radiant gods, the grieving voice of Ur's lament. When these scholars translated the tablets, they were struck not by the grandeur of her myth, but by its softness. Many Mesopotamian gods were associated with storms, war, creation, or cosmic battles. But Ningal's stories carried gentler tones. They spoke of listening, nurturing, and walking quietly through the world. This difference intrigued researchers, who began piecing together the fragments of her presence, tracing them through hymns, laments, ritual texts, and administrative tablets that documented offerings left at her temples. Through these discoveries, a picture of her influence emerged, not dominant or forceful, but foundational in ways that shaped daily life and emotional continuity for ancient communities. Some scholars noted that her role as a mother of major deities placed her near the top of the divine family tree, yet she did not achieve the same prominence in later cultural memory. They wondered why. They debated whether her association with dusk and gentle transitions made her less visible than deities linked to dramatic events. They studied the evolution of worship practices and found that earlier eras emphasized nurturing and balance, values embodied by Ningal. But as civilizations grew more complex and faced greater political turmoil, worship shifted toward gods who represented power, protection, and decisive intervention. This shift contributed to her gradual fading from the forefront of popular mythology. Yet for those who studied her, the quieter nature of her presence became part of her significance. Scholars saw in her story an example of how ancient cultures valued gentleness as a divine attribute, something as worthy of reverence as strength. They traced her influence through the temple complexes of and uncovered artifacts that reflected her early marshland symbols: reeds, water jars, crescent shapes, and silver ornaments that mirrored moonlight. Each discovery added depth to her identity, revealing a goddess who helped shape the emotional texture of early civilization. Meanwhile, skeptics approached her story from a different angle. They questioned whether her myths represented a historical figure or whether she was purely symbolic. They examined the laments in which she pleaded for her city, wondering whether these texts reflected real emotional responses preserved through poetic tradition, or whether they were literary constructs designed to express communal grief. They debated whether people truly believed she wandered through ruins after the fall of or whether that image served as a metaphor for the loss experienced by its inhabitants. These discussions didn't diminish her presence. They broadened it, allowing new interpretations to take shape. Some skeptics focused on her role in the divine family. They analysed the genealogy of gods and questioned the symbolic purposes behind her placement. They examined how celestial deities represented natural cycles and how Ningal's identity connected the lunar glow to the nurturing rhythms of Earth. They suggested that her myth may have evolved from older traditions associated with local water goddesses. Others argued that she represented an idealized form of motherhood rooted in agricultural life. Through these interpretations, they brought her story into realms of cultural anthropology and ancient psychology, exploring how early societies expressed their values through gentle deities. Yet even skeptics, despite their questions, could not ignore the emotional resonance her myths carried. The laments written in her voice moved them, not because they believed every line described literal events, but because they sensed the depth of human feeling preserved in the text. They saw the grief of a civilization mourning its home, reflected through the sorrow of a goddess who had nurtured the city for centuries. Whether she walked through the ruins or not, the story conveyed truths about loss, endurance, and hope. In this way, Ningal's myths continued to speak across time, even to those who viewed them through analytical rather than spiritual lenses. As interest in ancient Mesopotamia grew, archaeologists, historians, and linguists collaborated to reconstruct her role in religious life. They studied temple inventories that listed offerings given in her honor: milk, bread, reeds, water, and small silver ornaments. These simple offerings revealed her close connection to everyday life. Unlike deities who received lavish sacrifices, Ningal was honored through gestures that reflected her nurturing identity. Scholars noted that even as cities expanded, people continued to associate her with natural elements rather than symbols of power. This observation led some researchers to argue that her influence persisted long after her name faded from common use. They saw elements of her identity reflected in later goddesses across the Near East, figures associated with motherhood, moonlight, or gentle guidance. They traced symbolic threads from her marshland origins to later traditions that emphasized the emotional support provided by divine figures. Through this comparative approach, they suggested that while Ningal's name might have receded from prominence, the qualities she embodied continued to shape cultural understanding of the divine. As scholarly interest in the region expanded in the 19th and 20th centuries, Ningal's presence found new advocates among writers and researchers who wanted to bring forgotten deities back into the public consciousness. They found her story compelling not because she wielded overwhelming power, but because she represented something rare in ancient mythology, a goddess whose influence rested on attentiveness and emotional connection. These writers described her as a figure who bridged the gap between earth and sky, between natural sanctuaries and celestial rhythms. They emphasized the significance of her marshland origins, seeing them as symbolic of the world's quiet beginnings. In the academic world, Ningal became part of discussions about the role of women in ancient religion. Scholars examined her as a model of divine motherhood, contrasting her with more forceful or complex goddesses like Inanna. They noted how her gentleness formed the foundation for the radiance embodied by her children, and how her nurturing identity provided emotional stability in mythic narratives. Some researchers argued that her story offered insight into how early societies viewed maternal strength, not as dominance, but as steadfast support. Skeptics continued to challenge these interpretations, arguing that modern perspectives might romanticize her identity. They noted that the evidence for her prominence was limited compared to other deities, and cautioned against reading too much into fragmented texts. Yet even as they debated her role, her presence remained a steady point of fascination. Whether scholars viewed her as a central figure or a symbolic creation, they acknowledged her importance in understanding the emotional landscape of ancient Mesopotamia. The rediscovery of her laments had a particularly profound impact on modern understanding of her story. These texts, written in sorrowful tones that describe destruction and loss, offered rare insight into how ancient people processed collective trauma. Scholars saw in her laments an early form of emotional expression that connected divine grief with human suffering. They recognized that these texts preserved not only religious beliefs, but the lived experience of a civilization facing upheaval. Through Ningal's voice, they heard the echoes of thousands of lives shaped by the fall of their city. The laments also contributed to the interpretation of her exile. Researchers studied how the imagery of wandering reflected the displacement experienced by people who fled their homes. They argued that Ningal's journey through destroyed landscapes symbolized the emotional journey of survivors. Through this lens, her story became a reflection of human resilience. Scholars viewed her wandering not as a literal movement of a goddess, but as a narrative expression of endurance in the face of loss. This interpretation strengthened her significance as a figure who bridged the divine and human realms. As modern scholarship progressed, Ningal's identity found new relevance. She became a subject of interest in studies exploring how ancient cultures used myth to process emotions and maintain social cohesion. Researchers noted that her nurturing presence provided comfort in times of uncertainty, offering a stabilizing influence in mythic narratives. They saw her as a figure whose importance extended beyond rituals and temples, shaping the psychological resilience of communities. Meanwhile, thinkers outside of academia, poets, storytellers, spiritual seekers, discovered her through translations of ancient texts. They were drawn to the calm, steady presence that defined her. Some wrote reinterpretations of her laments, blending ancient sorrow with modern reflections. Others drew inspiration from her identity as the forgotten queen of the night sky, crafting works that celebrated her gentle radiance. These creative interpretations brought her story into new cultural spaces, allowing her presence to resonate with individuals seeking quiet guidance in contemporary life. In these modern retellings, Ningal became a symbol of emotional endurance, of quiet strength that survives the collapse of worlds. Writers described her as a figure who walked through the ruins of ancient cities carrying the memories of countless lives. They portrayed her as a goddess who listened not only to the whispers of marshlands, but to the unspoken griefs carried by generations. Through this lens, her forgotten status became part of her identity. A reminder that significance does not require fame, that a gentle presence can shape the world in ways not immediately visible. The legacy of her name continued to drift through academic circles, artistic communities, and spiritual discussions. Scholars, skeptics, and dreamers each found something meaningful in her story. To some, she represented a piece of ancient history waiting to be understood. To others, she symbolized a divine presence that endured quietly across time, and to many she embodied a forgotten form of strength, rooted in listening, nurturing, and guiding through the softest details of the world. In this way, Ningal's identity stretched from ancient marshlands into the modern imagination, preserved not through temples or grand myths alone, but through the echoes carried by moonlight, echoes that continued to illuminate her presence long after the world she once walked had changed into something entirely new. As the world slowly shifted into modern consciousness, and distant centuries settled like sediment across the forgotten stories of the past, the presence of ancient goddesses lingered in ways few fully understood. Their names appeared in fragments of clay, in the faint etchings left by hands long gone, in whispers preserved across generations of storytellers who had no intention of becoming historians. Ningal, shaped by marshlands and lunar glow, existed at the intersection between myth and memory, a figure who bridged the emotional landscape of early civilization with the subtler truths about the human mind, the natural world, and the scientific patterns woven into the structure of life. Her presence, like so many ancient goddesses, carried layers that modern thinkers began to recognize not merely as mythic imagination, but as early attempts to articulate observations of the natural world. When scholars re-examined the myths of Ningal, they noticed something remarkable. Her identity was not built on dramatic cosmic battles or divine victories over chaos. Instead, she embodied the quiet forces that shaped life: light, water, rhythm, transition, emotional endurance. These forces, though gentle, were essential to survival. They influenced migratory patterns, agricultural cycles, psychological stability, and the structure of early communities. The science embedded within these myths wasn't framed in equations or theories, but in narrative forms that reflected the earliest understanding of how life moved and adapted. People of the ancient world mapped natural rhythms onto divine personalities, creating goddesses who embodied patterns they observed long before the tools of modern science existed. Ningal, in particular, contained within her story a subtle representation of biological and environmental systems. The marshlands where she first formed symbolized the environments that nurtured early human settlement. Wetlands provided water, food, reeds for construction, and a stable ecosystem that allowed communities to flourish. The stories of Ningal walking through the reeds, listening to the soft movements of water and wind, reflected a keen awareness of how survival depended on attentiveness to environmental cues. This attentiveness was not described in scientific terms, yet it mirrored the principles of ecology. The movements of reeds indicated changes in wind direction. The height of water reflected seasonal shifts. The sounds of the marsh revealed patterns in wildlife behavior. By giving these patterns a divine identity, early people preserved knowledge that helped them navigate their world. When modern researchers studied the myths associated with Ningal, they noticed how often her presence was tied to moments of transition. Dusk, the edge of the marsh, the shifting brightness of the moon, all represented boundaries where change occurred. In science, transitional states often hold clues to underlying processes. The boundary between day and night reveals atmospheric shifts. The boundary between land and water reveals ecological interactions. The boundary between memory and myth reveals the cognitive patterns that shaped ancient storytelling. Ningal moved through these boundaries with ease, carrying with her the symbolic structure of moments when observation was most meaningful. Her connection to the moon held scientific roots as well. The lunar cycle influenced tides, agricultural rhythms, and nocturnal navigation. The glow that reflected on marshland water allowed early people to travel safely at night, tend to fields, or gather resources after sunset. Myths surrounding her children, Nanna, Utu, and Inanna, reflected celestial movements that guided timekeeping. The moon itself served as a natural calendar long before written systems existed. Communities built rituals around its phases, not simply for spiritual reasons, but because the moon provided reliable patterns that organised their lives. Ningal, as the mother of these celestial radiances, represented the emotional understanding of cosmic order. Her nurturing of lunar and solar deities mirrored the dependence communities had on the dependable cycles of the sky. In examining these myths through a scientific lens, scholars began to see how goddess narratives preserved information about the natural environment. The gentle qualities associated with Ningal reflected the stability required for early societies to grow. Her attentiveness represented the observational skills necessary to understand ecological shifts. Her nurturing identity reflected the interdependence between humans and their surroundings. These interpretations did not diminish the spiritual significance of her stories, but illuminated how ancient people encoded scientific understanding within mythic form. Cognitive science added another layer to the interpretation of ancient goddesses. Human memory often works through narrative structures that link emotional significance with sensory detail. The stories passed down about Ningal contained a blend of emotional depth and environmental specificity that made them memorable. Her laments expressed sorrow in ways that resonated deeply with human experience, allowing communities to process collective trauma. Her early presence in the marshlands connected her story to the sensory world of reeds, water, and moonlight, images that grounded her identity in real environmental contexts. This combination of emotional resonance and sensory grounding made her myths durable across generations, preserving ecological and psychological insights long after the original context changed. Anthropologists studying the myth of Ningal noted how her nurturing identity reflected the social structures of early agricultural societies. In these communities, cooperation and emotional support were essential for survival. People lived in close quarters, sharing resources, building homes together, and raising children within extended families. The nurturing qualities embodied by Ningal echoed these social structures, reinforcing the values required for communal stability. Her calm presence, her attentiveness, and her emotional endurance modelled behaviours that held societies together. Through her, communities preserved the importance of empathy, observation, and resilience. Skeptics, however, often challenged these interpretations, suggesting that reading modern science into ancient myth risked imposing contemporary frameworks onto stories that were never meant to serve scientific purposes. They argued that the myths should be approached on their own terms, as expressions of cultural values rather than encoded scientific observations. Yet even skeptics acknowledged that myths emerged from a desire to understand the world, and that early societies lacked the tools we now use to analyse natural phenomena. Myth was their method of explanation. Whether intentionally or not, these stories often carried insights that aligned with what modern science would eventually articulate. This debate revealed something about the nature of myth itself. Stories like those of Ningal existed in a space where subjective experience and objective observation intertwined. Ancient people watched the rising moon, the shifting water, the behaviour of birds at dusk. They witnessed the effects of seasons, the movement of stars, and the emotional rhythms within their communities. They wove these observations into narratives that carried both meaning and memory. Myth became a form of early cognitive science, a way of organising information, preserving knowledge, and shaping understanding. Ningal's myth in particular reflected the psychology of emotional processing. Her laments expressed grief not in abstract terms, but in sensory detail. Dust settling on ruined walls, silence replacing familiar sounds, light dimming on broken streets. These elements allowed individuals and communities to process loss in concrete, embodied ways. Modern psychologists noted that this kind of expression mirrored therapeutic approaches that help people navigate trauma. By personifying collective grief in the figure of Ningal, ancient communities preserved a method for coping that extended across generations. Her wandering through ruined landscapes symbolised the emotional journey from stability to loss, and from loss to endurance. This narrative allowed communities to make sense of upheaval, preserving a sense of continuity even when their physical environment changed. The science embedded in this story lay in its psychological accuracy. Human beings respond to trauma with searching, with reflection, with attempts to make meaning. Ningal's exile mirrored these internal processes, offering a symbolic guide for emotional navigation. Environmental science also found its place in the study of her myth. The wetlands where she first walked played crucial roles in early ecosystems. They acted as natural filtration systems, moderated floods, and created habitats for countless species. The stories of Ningal listening to the reeds and water reflected a deep awareness of how these ecosystems operated. Her presence in the marshlands aligned with the stability provided by wetlands. When the myths described her leaving these sanctuaries, they mirrored the environmental degradation that occurred as cities expanded and natural habitats were altered. Scholars began to see her story as an early recognition of the environmental balance necessary for civilization. As scientific interest continued to grow, researchers used the myth of Ningal to understand how early societies integrated natural phenomena into their spiritual frameworks. They saw in her identity a reflection of how people understood the connection between the natural world and emotional well-being. They studied how lunar cycles influenced sleep patterns, hormonal regulation, and mood. They noted how darkness and light shaped human behaviour, how proximity to water influenced settlement patterns, and how communal rituals shaped psychological resilience. Each of these elements appeared in her mythic structure, suggesting that the stories preserved more than symbolic meaning. They preserved an early understanding of human biology and environmental science. Modern thinkers outside of academic fields found their own interpretations. Some viewed her as a goddess of emotional intelligence, representing the ability to listen deeply and respond with calm clarity. Others saw her as a figure of environmental awareness, embodying the interconnectedness between human life and natural ecosystems. Spiritual practitioners interpreted her as a presence that reflected the quiet cycles of the moon, guiding people through transitions with steady light. These interpretations may not have aligned with ancient intentions, yet they reflected the fluidity that made her myth enduring. Ningal's identity could shift across time without losing its essence, because it was built on qualities that remained relevant across cultures: nurturing, listening, enduring, guiding. These qualities carried scientific resonance, reflecting principles of psychology, ecology, and astronomy in ways that modern thinkers could appreciate even without the context of ancient belief. The science hidden within the story of Ningal did not diminish her mythic presence. Instead, it illuminated the depth of early human understanding. Her identity remained a bridge between the symbolic world of myth and the empirical world of observation. She represented the human desire to make sense of gentle forces, to understand the rhythms that shaped life, to find meaning in the cycles of light and darkness. Through her, ancient people preserved insights about their environment, their emotions, and their communities in ways that modern science could later decode. As her significance continued to unfold through the lenses of scholarship and reflection, Ningal's myth became more than a relic of the past. It became a testament to how early civilizations understood the world through narratives that merged experience with imagination. Her presence lingered in the liminal spaces where science and story intersected, reminding modern thinkers that even the quietest figures of ancient myth carried layers of meaning that extended far beyond their original context. As the story moves forward, these layers continue to shape how her legacy is understood, through memory, through interpretation, through the soft illumination of moonlight that still carries her gentle influence across time. As the long arc of history extended far beyond the lifetimes of the first storytellers, and the ancient cities shifted slowly into dust beneath new landscapes and rising horizons, the presence of Ningal drifted into places neither her earliest worshippers nor her later scholars could have predicted. She belonged to the earliest memories of a civilization shaped by marshlands, moonlight, reeds, and the quiet hum of waters that carried life across the southern plains. Yet as centuries turned into eras and those eras dissolved into the broad sweep of time, her identity continued to live in subtle ways. Her name no longer echoed through grand temple halls, but her presence lingered in forms that remained steady, soft, and enduring. What stands out most in the long progression of her story is how gently she moved through history. Many ancient deities persisted through spectacle, through dramatic myths retold for generations, through grand narratives carved into stone, through the kind of forceful symbolism that demanded remembrance. Ningal never sought that path. Her legacy was shaped by the qualities that defined her from the beginning. She listened, she nurtured, she guided in moments where strength came not from domination but from understanding. And because these qualities continued to matter through every age, long after temples fell, long after cities crumbled, long after empires reshaped the land, her presence found ways to remain. The legacy she carried began with the marshlands, where she first embodied the quiet rhythms that nurtured life. Even as wetlands across the ancient world changed or disappeared, the memory of places where reeds swayed in gentle breezes continued to influence how people imagined calm. The image of still water touched by moonlight became a symbol for peace across many cultures, even those who never knew her name. When people lit small lamps during the quiet hours of evening, or when they paused at the edge of a river to watch the shifting light, they reenacted gestures that once belonged to her worshippers. Her sanctuary lived on in these simple acts, as though the earliest human memories had embedded her presence into the natural experience of nightfall. The lunar glow she nurtured through her divine lineage carried her legacy even further. The moon shaped countless cycles of agriculture, of travel, of spiritual practice, of emotional rhythm. In every culture that looked up at the night sky and found comfort in its steady presence, echoes of her influence lived on. People didn't need to know her name to feel what she represented. The gentle light that fell across fields, rooftops, and water surfaces served as a silent continuation of her nurturing role. It offered calm in darkness, consistency in uncertainty, and reassurance in moments when the world felt unstable. Her gentle influence merged with the natural world, becoming part of a celestial pattern so familiar that humans carried it forward without thinking. This continuity extended into cultural memory. Even after her direct worship faded, stories of similar goddesses emerged in other regions, carrying traits that reflected her earliest identity. Figures associated with the moon, with nurturing, with transitions between light and darkness, with emotional endurance, appeared across different mythologies, some strikingly similar in tone. While these deities were shaped by their own cultural contexts, the threads connecting them suggested something deeper, that the qualities embodied by Ningal were essential to how humans understood comfort, stability, and care. Her identity had dissolved into a broader archetype, woven into the shared psychological patterns that shaped human narratives. This archetype persisted in the rituals surrounding dusk. Across the world, people developed customs where the boundary between day and night carried emotional significance. They lit candles at evening, performed quiet prayers during sunset, or simply paused to watch the shifting colours of the sky. These moments held a calm that mirrored the atmosphere of her temples. Even without knowing it, people kept alive the rhythm she represented. Moments of reflection built into the structure of daily life. The softness of twilight became a universal symbol of transition, shaped not by her alone, but by the ancient memory of deities who guided this gentle shift. The laments associated with her story also carried a legacy that extended beyond myth. They preserved one of the earliest examples of how civilizations processed trauma through narrative. The sorrow she expressed in those ancient texts provided a model for understanding collective loss, shaping how communities coped with upheaval. Modern readers who encountered those translations felt the emotional weight carried through the centuries, not because they worshipped her, but because grief recognised across time remained grief. The lament of Ningal preserved the humanity of a distant civilization, reminding later generations that the emotional endurance she represented was part of the fabric of human experience. Even the idea of her wandering through ruined streets carried influence. The image of a gentle goddess moving through devastation resonated with later stories across cultures, where divine figures walked among the broken or the displaced. These narratives reflected the resilience found in her myth, not through victory, but through presence. She did not rebuild cities with force. She walked with the people as they rebuilt them themselves. Her wandering became a symbol for continuity, even in the face of destruction. In later scholarship, her presence served as a bridge between ancient spirituality and the unfolding understanding of human cognition. Researchers recognized that the qualities associated with her, attentiveness, nurturing, emotional resilience, aligned with patterns identified in psychology and anthropology. They saw in her myth the earliest expressions of empathy and environmental awareness. They understood that ancient people did not separate emotion from observation, but wove them together through figures like Ningal, who offered a model for how to move through the world with sensitivity and balance. This interpretation led to a renewed appreciation of her role. She was no longer viewed simply as a deity of a distant past, but as a symbol of how humans conceptualized care long before scientific frameworks existed. The stories told about her listening to the world echoed modern concepts of mindfulness and emotional presence. Her nurturing of celestial radiance reflected the human understanding of natural cycles. Her laments mirrored the ways communities expressed grief. Her exile represented endurance through displacement. Each part of her myth carried layers that resonated with human behaviour across ages. Her influence extended into artistic expression as well. Painters, poets, and writers who encountered her story in translation found a quiet beauty in her presence. She appeared in works that explored the tension between fragility and strength, in writings that honoured the calm persistence of those who endure hardship, and in interpretations that blended memory with imagination. These creative expressions kept her identity alive in subtle ways, allowing her to move into the modern world not as a figure of direct worship, but as a symbol of emotional clarity and gentle resilience. As her legacy drifted through scholarship, art and reflection, it began to take shape in places far removed from her origins. People who had never heard of or the marshlands of ancient Mesopotamia found meaning in the idea of a goddess who listened without judgment, who guided without force, who endured without bitterness. Her identity, once tied to a specific environment and culture, became universal in its emotional resonance. She represented the strength found in gentleness, the wisdom found in observation, and the comfort found in steady presence. This universality shaped how her story was understood in the modern world. Ningal became a reminder of the quieter forces that sustain life, forces often overlooked because they do not announce themselves loudly. The calm that settles at dusk, the reassuring glow of moonlight, the endurance found in steady rhythms, the emotional clarity gained by listening. These forms of subtle influence became her lasting legacy. They shaped human behaviour long after her worship faded, guiding people through transitions and uncertainties in ways that remained natural rather than ceremonial. The scientific interpretations of her myth only strengthened this legacy. As researchers uncovered connections between lunar cycles and human sleep patterns, between environmental stability and emotional health, between storytelling and cognitive resilience, they found echoes of her identity in modern understanding. The ancient recognition of her influence reflected early observations of phenomena that science later explained. This convergence of ancient narrative and modern insight showed that her presence existed not only in memory, but in the structure of life itself. The emotional resonance of her story continued to shape interpretations across different fields. In psychology, she represented the ability to remain steady through sorrow. In anthropology, she reflected the social values that held early communities together. In environmental studies, she symbolized the relationship between human life and ecological balance. In literary analysis, she stood as an example of how narrative preserved cultural wisdom. Through each of these lenses, her presence remained relevant, not as a distant myth, but as a figure woven into the symbolic understanding of human experience. As the world moved further into the modern age, the landscape she once walked changed dramatically. The marshlands transformed under shifting climates. The ruins of lay quiet under layers of time. The silver ornaments that once decorated her altars sat behind glass in museums, illuminated by artificial light. Yet even in these altered environments, her presence lingered. The artifacts preserved her memory, the translations carried her voice, the scientific discussions interpreted her significance, the stories retold her sorrow and her resilience. Through all of this, she continued to drift through time with the same calm she carried from the beginning. Her legacy became a reflection of the human instinct to remember through feeling rather than declaration. People didn't need shrines to sense what she represented. They found fragments of her in the quiet hours of evening, in the gentle glow that softened the edges of the world, in the resilience that guided them through difficult moments. They found her in the emotional patience required to navigate hardship, in the steady presence offered to others in times of sorrow, in the moments when listening mattered more than speaking. This diffuse, lingering presence was entirely in keeping with who she had always been. Ningal never demanded recognition. She moved quietly, shaping the spaces where calm was needed. Her touch appeared in the small, steady gestures that made life bearable through centuries of change. She didn't leave monuments that reached toward the sky. She left the memory of a sanctuary made of reeds and water. She left the glow of the moon falling gently across the world. She left the image of a goddess who understood the importance of listening in a world that often spoke too loudly. As time continued its unbroken movement forward, her presence remained part of a collective memory that no single culture owned. She existed at the intersection of myth and lived experience, reflecting truths that resonated as deeply in modern lives as they did in the world that first imagined her. Her light lingered because it didn't depend on temples or rituals. It depended on the rhythms of life itself, on dusk settling quietly across the land, on moonlight travelling through the night sky, on the gentle strength found in nurturing, on the resilience carried through sorrow. In these rhythms her legacy remained steady, woven into the unfolding of every age, an enduring reflection of a presence shaped by water, by light, by memory, and by the quiet endurance that carried her through worlds that rose, flourished, vanished, and transformed, while her gentle influence continued to drift softly across time,